Good morning and welcome to day 2 of ATT&CKcon. Thanks for joining us here at MITRE McLean and those of you who are online. We had a pretty fantastic day yesterday. Speaking of online, we've had over 3,000 views of yesterday's live stream so far. So that's pretty impressive. We had so much fun yesterday, I think, as a group, that we thought we'd put it together in a little video. So here's yesterday compressed into about 2 minutes.
I remember I came back from a business trip in India, and it was all everyone wanted to talk about our team. We're doing attack, and I had no idea what that was at all. But I knew I better figure it out. So I actually knew a couple people up at MITRE. I traveled up here and started talking with them about some of the questions we had in our process and just how we were just starting to figure out how to integrate that into our operations. And, really it just kind of clicked right away. We had great leadership buy-in, and we really just knew that integrating it into our everyday operations, end to end, from intelligence collection all the way to deployment of custom signatures, was the way to go. And we've been doing it all day, every day since then.
When we talk to different clients who then are asked by their executives and their management teams about how it is that we're addressing things that they're seeing when they talk to the community. When clients can go pull reports out of our platform that are directly mapped to MITRE, then it just shows really great relevancy to what we do. So they go, well, we were asked specifically about be it command and control or a type of lateral movement set of actions. They can take our huge inventory of methods and techniques, pick just the ones that matter to that part of the conversation, go in, have that conversation with their management teams, and then back away. So sometimes there's an overwhelming amount of information that's out there. And the fact that the framework allows our folks to, our clients to break what they're doing down into manageable conversations, it takes a lot of the anxiety out of things for them. So that's what we're really proud of.
The advice I have for others looking to implement a TAC is that it's really helpful to give the whole context of the tactic and the technique, or even as we did, like the higher level objective with the tactic and technique, so people have the context that goes with the technique itself.
So what advice do I have for others who are looking to do what I've done with the TAC? Just jump right in. Learning process that you go through as you work with the TAC is way more valuable than waiting until you've got it all figured out.
Well, day one was pretty awesome. I think we're going to have an even better day two. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce Gary Gagnon. Gary is responsible for developing and leading MITRE's overall cyber strategy and guiding its execution across all of MITRE. As Chief Security Officer, he directs MITRE's physical and cybersecurity efforts, promoting security as a strategic asset in executing the corporate strategy. At MITRE, Gary pioneered the transformation from a vulnerability-based approach to a threat-based strategy, allowing us to identify emerging cyber threats. Gary has recently rejoined MITRE after most recently serving as Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer at Amazon. Please welcome Gary Gagnon.
Good morning. You guys hear me? Okay. So yeah, welcome to day two. I hope day two is going to be as fascinating as day one. I got a lot out of it, and I hope you guys did too. So as Rich said, this is my second stint back at MITRE. I was here for 20 some odd years and went off to Amazon for a little while, and I came back because I really believed in the MITRE mission. As Rich said, I am the Corporate Director for Cybersecurity, but I'm also the Chief Security Officer. That position was established in 2009, and it was purposely put together so that we can experiment on our own networks. You heard some of that yesterday when we heard references to things like FMX, which was essentially a live red team on an operational network looking at adversarial actions right of exploit. So MITRE's had a long and unique history in the cybersecurity space, basically acting as a trusted third party, right? We bring industry together, we bring industry and government together. We did things like CVE, Sticks and Taxi, and now Attack are examples of that long history. We develop our intellectual property only to give it away to industry and let industry try to advance it, right? So we have no real intellectual property that we hang on to ourselves. We find that it has to be in industry's hands if we're going to make some good out of it. And then we try to pioneer with industry and government. It's never a one-way communication. It's really trying to create a dialogue between that. So those of you who heard Blake's talk yesterday, there was one key element of Blake's talk that he omitted that I guess I want to bring up today. So when I released the attack matrix in 2015, as Blake indicated, it met with a lot of controversy. People were critical of me for releasing it, and I purposely wanted to get it out there for two primary reasons. One, I wanted to create a dialogue with industry around our experiences and understanding adversarial actions right of exploit. And the second is I was looking to get a new class of endpoint products that could be behavioral based that would be much better than the signature based products that we were seeing in the marketplace. What we didn't say at the time, which we're talking about now, was the body of knowledge that Blake was able to dive into was almost 10 years of deception operations that MITRE was doing on its network. We had been engaging with APT actors for quite a while, really getting them go deep into their life cycle of their attack and gathering information that we could put into our repository. We called it CRITS, Collaborative Research into Threat Sharing, which we also open sourced to put it out on GitHub. Blake and his team was able to dive into that corpus of knowledge and really come up with what later became the attack framework. So when we released it, we were pretty confident that we got it right for APT actors, but we recognized that we probably didn't have a lot of criminal actors in our repository. A lot of criminal people just don't like to attack nonprofits for some reason. I don't know why. So we were, like I said, we were pretty confident, and I think yesterday and today is indication that I think the approach is working. We have a community of folks that have come together, really want to try to share their experiences and using attack and how the different unique ways that they're using it. I think that's great. MITRE is committed to try to keep this community alive and vibrant. I think we started something here and we wanted to see it continue, starting initially probably off just the attack framework and using methodologies and the like, and trying to share some experiences. But there are other things I think we can do with this community. As I indicated, we had done a lot of deception operations. I think we could work with the community to kind of hone the tradecraft around deception operations for detection, but more importantly for intelligence gathering. I think collaborative defense is another key area. We all recognize that cyber is now a team sport. People are really working together to try to help each other out. And the term collaborative defense seems to be emerging as a key topic area. And I think there's something that this group might be able to do in that. I'm also working on something that I affectionately call the SOC of the future. So it's not a more efficient SOC, it's a more effective SOC. And what are the tools and tradecraft and capabilities you'd want to put in what that next generation could be that makes it more effective? Basically not operating in isolation, but recognizing that SOCs are starting to share more information amongst each other. And how would that look? And we're creating a platform inside MITRE where we're actually going to try to demonstrate some of these concepts out. And we'd be glad to share that with you as things move on. I think we have a pretty outstanding community right here. And like I said, we're committed to keeping this thing going. And we'd like to inject some new ideas into it as we move forward and see if you guys are interested in any of the other topics that we're trying to advance in cybersecurity. And then you'll hear from Rich later in the day on what some of the specifics of the next few steps are. So with that, welcome to day 2.
Thank you very much, Gary. It's now my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Adam Pennington. He's curated 4 lightning talks. Usually lightning talks get stuck at the end of the day, 4 of a conference, and half the people are on a plane or whatever. And Adam said, no, let's actually give these folks front and center. And so here we have the lightning talks and Adam Pennington.
Okay. So I'm Adam Pennington, part of the attack team and also coordinating bingo and lightning talks. So I wanted to start off technical session this morning with something to try to get people's blood pumping a little bit. We put out a call just a couple weeks ago for people to give us pithy, short 5-minute, 0 to 3 slide talks that were on either work in progress, something that was half baked. We even told people they could give us a 5-minute rant on everything we were doing wrong with attack, but no one took us up on it. So what we have instead are talks you'll be seeing in a few minutes. We're going to run these back to back, so no time for questions. All the speakers are actually attendees at the conference, though, so plenty of opportunity to catch them as they're out and about. Got the handheld mic ready to go. And so without further ado, I'm going to have our most interesting interpretation of 0 to 3 slides, Paul Ewing and Ross Wolf of Endgame.
Hey, how's everybody doing? Awesome. I'm going to start a stopwatch as well. So we did have a very different interpretation. So we tried to convert a video into slides. So you guys better be ready for a montage of slideware. Okay, so I'm Paul. This is Ross. We're going to give you a practical guide of taking an attack technique and then actually try to parlay that into a detection. So at Endgame, we're no different than the theme of the conference so far. If you can incorporate attack, you're really going to transform the way you do things. But the thing to keep in mind is it's not as trivial as you may think to take a technique and turn that into a detection. In fact, we made this kind of fun, almost graph to show what it's like to groom a detection. So, I mean, I like to think of this as an example where, say you're looking for a scheduled task, Turns out you have a group policy script that's a scheduled task. Okay, tons of false positives. And then you start finding some applications in your environment that cause more false positives. Then you fine tune your rule too much and you do too many things, you miss out on stuff. And eventually you get to a point where you can profit. So we're going to walk through some of this right now.
Cool. So let's say you've done some gap analysis and you've decided, all right, the next technique I want to detect is bypass UAC. So yeah, this counts for bingo, I think. So you pick your technique, you go to attack. This is, I guess, attack-old.mitre.org. And you might read up on it and realize, okay, bypass UAC actually has a lot of flavors, a lot of different ways you can do it. So maybe you Google, you look around, you pick one, and you see that, okay, well, I actually want to detonate this technique since I want to detect it. I want to know what it looks like. And there's this blog post I found that just says, run these two commands in an unelevated shell, and it will give you an elevated shell. So at the top, you see the unelevated shell. The two commands I pasted, and then it successfully ran the task. And then at the bottom, we've got like an elevated shell. Cool, it worked. And then once we're here, we actually want to leave a trail for ourselves to actually start walking up and figure out the process tree of where we are. So we can run a command. And then the next step would be start searching for it. So we've got some helpful PowerShell scripts you can use to grab sysmon logs out. I'm not going to read these. And so for bypass UAC, the most useful piece of telemetry, I would say, just from looking at this and this technique in particular, is command line monitoring. So you run the script and you say, all right, give me the most recent process executions. And so now we've got process executions. We want to search them and figure out where our command was. And so we left a token for us to find, just called find me. And so we search find me in the command line, and we get the process where we were. And it's running elevated, so we can see that from the integrity level. There's also this field called parent process GUID. So we can walk up the tree, the process tree, see the parent, and the parent looks kind of weird because it actually matches the command we ran earlier. So, okay, this is noteworthy. And we run up one step further and realize this parent is actually legitimate Windows running, and we can look up that service and see, oh, it's just the task scheduler. Okay, that's too far. So we kind of think we know where we ended and what we want to look for. So the next step would be, how do we take that knowledge and turn that into a useful analytic? So now we can refine the command line and say, okay, find me anything that has this substring. How does that work? Okay, we found what we did. We did it earlier. We found that too. Oh, well, shoot. The thing ran legitimately. This is totally benign. This is just Windows. We don't want to detect this. So we refine our query and we say, okay, now find one that matches this, but not that. And we get a hit, and we get our other hit from testing the technique a second time, and that was it. So we've got some prototype. The next step would be for us to actually take that, leave Windows at that point, because now we actually need to test it maybe on real endpoints with our sim, whatever that happens to be. And so we would translate this to equal, which is the language we use. So this would be just like the one-liner for this rule. Here's what this would look like. So like look for this clean manager with an extra space in the beginning. And then we just search all of our endpoints. How are we doing with this? Because we're still refining the analytic, and we see 24 hits. So it's not quite right. And so we can tune this. We find that, oh, this is just legitimate Windows. Let me adjust my query, rip that out. Now we have no hits. At this point, we've got like a decent detection.
Yeah, so I guess in like the final seconds here, so pretty incredible. We actually got it through in 5 minutes. But so we're not saying anything earth-shattering by ignoring a parent process is going to fine-tune your rules in every case. We're not trying to share that. We're just trying to share the actual process. So if I had more time, I'd rant on some of these, but just to pick one out of just unique things, the second one is always kind of fun, where say you're trying to look for a malicious link. And so you said, oh, I want to know about a browser launched from Outlook that then dropped a PowerShell script. Makes perfect sense. But I'll tell you what users do is when they read their email first thing in the morning, they click that legitimate link, they open up a browser, and then, oh, see, look at that, perfect timing. But they open up a browser, and then they do their normal business, and then eventually they do something that triggers your analytic, which you've now associated with Outlook. So again, you have to use temporal analysis and really think about your analytics. But anyway, thanks for your time. Happy to talk more about this.
Phone. Okay, close to 5 minutes. So next up we have Bryson Borg and Travis McWaters from Pepsi. Ross has your phone.
Ross, is your phone? Oh, Mike's. Clicker.
Good morning. I'm Fred Stankowski, and this is Travis McWaters. We're from PepsiCo Information Security, and we're going to talk about our detection catalog today and how it's been influenced by the attack framework. This is a very high-level overview of our organization today. I don't think it's anything anybody here hasn't seen before. The big takeaways, there are two of them. The first will be that this has been a journey for us. We were a very compliance-focused organization initially. We've now migrated to a much more threat-oriented and security operations-oriented organization. And Travis and myself are part of the threat detection operations part of this, and we focus on threat hunting and managing the detection catalog. So why do you need a detection catalog? So I think a lot of the themes here we've heard yesterday, and they'll probably continue on today. The first is you need to have a historical record. So what kind of things did we do 6 months ago? What kind of decisions did we make when we're looking at logs and analysis? What do we want to do going forward, and where do we track that? Additionally, it's knowledge transfer. So we went from a 2-person organization to a 7-person organization. As part of that, how do I get somebody involved in understanding our environment quickly, and how do we communicate how we can detect and where we can detect? Additionally, is how do I express that to my threat intelligence organization? How do I express that to my incident response organization, as well as to my senior leadership? Additionally, it's work management. So it's not just, the big part of this is who's on first, who's doing what are they focused on? But additionally is, as you start to building your detection catalog, you're developing processes. And those processes lead forward to being able to develop workflows, automation, and capture metrics. So we didn't have a spreadsheet of pain, but we had a OneNote of pain. This was our first go at this. As you can see, we started deciding what kind of things we wanted to capture as far as data points were concerned, as well as our first go of what our naming nomenclature was going to be. We evolved to this into a open source ticketing system. You can see we started improving our naming nomenclature. We started being able to capture metrics and taking advantage of what a ticketing system can do for you. There's some pluses and minuses, but it did allow us to have some exposure to automation, as well as improving our workflow, as well as being able to capture more specific parts of each detection as we went on. So today, we've moved into a wiki, and as a part of this migration, we moved to Palantir. They have an ADS framework, which is open source and on GitHub, and it's essentially a framework that allows you to decide how you build out your detection catalog, and has a very rigorous set of explanations of why you do certain things you do in your detections. Very rigorous. It allows us to do a much better job detailing why we're doing what we're doing with each detection. And as a part of this migration, we also moved into looking at moving the entire thing into a, we're using Bitbucket here, but into a repo. So we want to be able to push the entire thing into some place where we have all the goodness you get. We're in a repo. In this case, we're focused primarily on what we're doing around automation, but initially we want to have everything over in there. And I'll turn it over to Travis.
So this is an example. There's like one more button there. Example ADS entry. This is the Palantir framework, which if you haven't seen, I highly recommend. You talk about your goal, the categorization, a strategy abstract, which is kind of the high level. What are you trying to do? And then you get into the technical context, which will be specific to your environment about here's where I have detection capability. You talk about your blind spots, which are both in the rule and also in your environment, where you get any false positives, and perhaps the best part, how you validate to make sure that when you want this thing to fire, it really does fire. And a little bit about priority and the response plan for your SOC analysts. When this does go off, what are you doing about it? Go ahead. So in terms of lessons learned, I think the first and perhaps most important is that nomenclature matters. How you talk about things affects how you view them. And having the framework from MITRE gives us a good language to share with each other about this is what we're looking for, this is what we're detecting. The other thing that I think we wish we had done differently is just go ahead and get into a source repo system sooner. The sooner you're in that mindset of having versions, keeping track of history over time, the better off you will be. And then finally, good documentation helps mitigate attrition and change in your environment when you have SOC analysts or even people on our team coming and going as your team grows. That pain that comes with that is lessened by having good documentation. So I finished with less than 5 minutes. Good for us. And no time for questions, but you can find us both. We'll be around for the rest of the day. Thank you both.
Next up, we have Nick Dunne and Matt Summers from NCC Group. Thanks. That's the end of the last talk. Shut up.
Hi, I'm Matt Summers from NCC Group. I'm a principal consultant, and we're here to present the use of game theory with the attack framework to produce better attack and defense strategies. And have I just switched that off?
There's a blackout.
Okay, and I'm Nick Dunne, also of NCC Group, working with Matt more in the offensive security kind of fields where we break things for fun and then give people a patronizing report on what to fix. This all began not so long ago when this is currently a work in progress for a white paper that we're going to publish in the short to medium term future. And it began quite recently when I released a paper on the economics of defense, which measured the costs of a breach compared to the costs of actually building improper defenses. And recently, shortly after that was published, Matt got in touch with me at work and said, have you thought this could be done so much better with game theory instead of money? And I explained that most of the audience were more interested in money than mathematics, but said I had recently done something with game theory in terms of looking at how botnets detection or evasion could be improved. This conversation rapidly escalated into a series of whiteboard sessions, and the two of us deciding that if we were going to look at game theory, we could sort of measure where resources for defense could best be distributed. And we thought the attack framework was the best way to do that in terms of coming up with these key points in the stages of the game that we were looking at. Quick crash course for anyone not familiar with game theory. It's defined as the study of mathematical models of strategic interaction between rational decision makers, which might sound complicated, but it's something that was developed in the 1940s by John von Neumann, who's probably more familiar to most people here for his pioneering work in the use of digital computers. But basically what it does is to come up with a series of mathematical way of measuring decisions that can be made by two cooperating or non-cooperating participants in decisions. And this really took off first in the field of economics and eventually started to become used more often in military strategy. And both Matt and I thought this could map quite well onto analysing the way two non-cooperating participants would undergo a cyber attack from the terms of the attacker and defender. There's a few different types of game theory, which Matt's about to talk about. So, sorry, Nick. So when we talk about the economics of this, typically we're thinking about sort of the buying and selling of products or marketing. What we're really interested in is understanding the payoff or what's called utility. Now, what you'd be familiar with if you've seen any game theory is Prisoner's Dilemma, which is a normal form game. But what we're interested in is an extensive form game where the players are non-cooperative, so therefore they're competing. I'm just going to take a little digression into something from a very famous military strategist called Karl von Clausewitz. And he said, "Doctrine is a guide to anyone who wants to learn about war from its books.
It will light their way, it will ease their progress and train their judgment and help avoid pitfalls. Doctrine is meant to educate the minds of the future commanders and not accompany them into the battlefields. And this is where we see attack coming in. So an attacker has a goal, right? They want to get information, they want to use your resources. So we decided to use attack because it's a framework for describing the chain. So consider mapping to attack a spear phishing attack. So how does the attacker guarantee success? What are the strategies or tactics they can employ to reach their end goal? So what we want to understand is the utility, which is quite difficult for us to define. So both players are considered to have imperfect and incomplete information. Therefore, so they don't know anything about their strategies, their payoffs, or anything about what each other player does. So Nick mentioned a rational player. There's no such thing as a rational player. This is stereotyping bias. But if we reference Emily's slides yesterday, what we would like to do is take that methodology and understand the costs and the payouts for each of the players so that we can better either define better strategies for defending or attacking a network.
And so our final speaker for the session is going to be Bryson Borg from Scythe. It's probably the best shirt of any of the speakers today.
All right, well, at least I got that down. Good morning. So I'm Bryson Borg, and there's probably only two things you need to know about me. One, I have an offensive security background, and two, I was an Army officer, which means that you're going to get very simple words, very simple concepts. If you want smart and complex, talk to Blake or somebody like Sunil who's actually got a brain. Oh, well, that changes. So in terms of thinking of things simple, I was one of many folks who was stumped yesterday when we got the questions and they said, go to the MITRE attack framework out there and put your pin to something. And I sat there and I looked at it for about 10 minutes. I'd be like, that one. Oh, wait, but I forgot about that one. Because there's so much. And I overheard several folks talking about the challenge with implementing this into our environment because we're talking about operationalizing it. I mean, it's great to have wonderful intellectual frameworks to think about. It's nice to have huge results in a lab, but what we want is something that changes things in the real world. And so the value that I think of when I think of the attack framework starts with, it's like the periodic table. It's a simple group of elements that allows us to all talk between each other in a common vernacular. On top of that, if we combine them, we can create complex equations and complex compounds that allows all of us to understand that. But at the same time, it's something that is still common so that a layperson can follow what we're doing. Going back to what the NCC group did, right? Most of us are offensive, and because of that, we are offensive to our customers. I know, that one was not as good. Now, there we go. So I simplify this as the potential attack space is there is an infinite number of ways to gain access. I can gain access through technical means. I can gain access through social means. I can gain access through insider threat, close access. There's an unlimited ways to gain access. Once I gain access, really it comes down to two things. I need to be able to talk, and I need to be able to do things. And if we look at that, then the MITRE attack framework provides us a confined attack space where we know that that is where the attacker is talking in some form and then doing certain things to their advantage. Keeping in mind, we only care about the things that affect us. If an attacker gets on a computer and plays Minecraft, we don't care. We care when they're stealing credentials. We care when they're doing different kinds of privilege escalation and they're doing the things that they can actually accomplish, either stealing or harm to us. And so the way that I've mapped the communications and behaviors back in is those high levels of the MITRE attack framework are really just those pieces. So where's the breakdown? Because we've got threat intelligence that has so much promise. We've heard some talks today that were talking about how do we create detection paths and how do we do different things to bring this into our environment. And the challenge that I see is I don't see any cyber threat intelligence that actually allows us to just automatically consume it. Giving a shout out to Palo Alto Unit 42 with the adversary playbooks, that's the closest I've seen where they're starting to look at how do we update sticks, how do we turn this into something where it is the red informing the blue to have a purple effect. But the threat intelligence is not automatically there. If you look at threat intelligence, we get a lot of ephemeral IOCs. and we get things where we can manually scrape it, but there hasn't yet been anything that automatically pulls that. Imagine that. If I could just have a catalog that is updated constantly, and then I'm able to run that through my detections without having to manually parse that. That's something I think the industry needs to move to. The other challenge we have is while the MITRE ATT&CK framework does a really good job of providing us this wide range of behaviors and an overall framework of understanding, isn't there that goal that we all want to just be able to go, I completely got this block across my organization? But why can't we do that? And the reason that we can't do that is that tension of when you actually start to look at where the bits meet the road, there's an infinite number of ways to do any one of those particular things. So I just called out 2 examples here of like where we're talking about binary padding, right? Binary padding would be the behavior, but there's 2 explicit ways to do that among many, and among many more. And so what we need to find is a way to both look at the MITRE ATT&CK framework, not only as that vernacular, but also as a driving ability to how do we constantly match that tension of an overall behavior detection, and then at the same time, not missing out the fact that we're talking about complex computers and finite state machines, and how does that actually happen down there at the bottom? Thank you.
So thank you very much to our lightning talk speakers for running right on time. Turns out we actually started a couple minutes early though. So they're telling me we do have time if any of our speakers are actually willing to take questions and don't run away too far to actually get questions from the audience. So if anyone has questions for our lightning talk speakers, especially if they're willing to answer them. Hand up mic to anyone who actually is the answer. Anyone? We have a mic we can throw right at you. Someone get a mic to this man in the back? If you could start with which speaker the question's actually for.
Thanks, guys. Sorry about that.
You're just speaking to the top. It's got to be turned on.
I can just speak loudly.
I can repeat the question for the audience at home.
The question is for Bryson. You said that if the adversary gets in and they're not doing something destructive, stealing credentials or something like that, if they're playing Minecraft, we don't care. I have a question about that. If the attacker gets on your resources and they're using them to mine digital currency, for example, I would argue that I do care about that. So how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I was going more for humor, but you're right. There's two elements to that, right? Of course, the mining. Someone mentioned yesterday I think it was Verizon was talking about the rise of crypto mining, and that comes down to the fact that cryptocurrencies are now actually worth something. I remember a few years ago when that wasn't the case. And so as we now have an increased amount of computational capacity available, that is a valuable asset worth stealing. The other thing is if you consider what did it take for them to get there, then that's unauthorized access and breaking your configuration controls, which that could be the level of which you do care.
Thank you. Anyone else? I'm going to be turning it back over to Rich Struess.
Thank you, Adam. And thanks to all our lightning talk speakers, and thanks for keeping us on schedule. So now we're going to turn to another way of looking at attack with a lens of how you can misuse attack in your security program. Our presenter, Kyle Rainey, spent years consulting in global enterprise incident response and forensic tasks for Fortune 500 companies, and as a security analyst at Red Canary, he helps lead the Security Operations Center's efforts to continuously develop and mature detection strategies. Please welcome Kyle Rainey.
See if I can figure this out. Can everyone hear me good? Thank you. Cool. Oh, there we go. Cool. So today we're going to be talking about some common pitfalls that my team and I have kind of observed over the past year and a half working with Attack. And really looking at this from, we look at it from a detection and response perspective. So that's where we're coming from. And these are the pitfalls that we identified essentially when we went to operationalize Attack a year and a half ago. A little bit about me really quick. We can just skip that really. Essentially, you did a great introduction. I've done incident response for a couple of years on a global team before coming to Red Canary, where I now help lead the detection strategies and detection engineering team to build new capabilities for our detection team. I'm also an avid snowboarder, and I teach children to snowboard at Breckenridge on the weekends. So moving into the talk, if we can get this to work, cool. So quick disclaimer. So I'm not going to be talking about how you shouldn't use Attack. It's essentially things that we've identified that are traps. You may see them. You may have come across these. Essentially, what we want to do is just bring that to the forefront, make sure everyone's aware of this, and kind of start a conversation how you can avoid them. And I'm going to share with you what we did to avoid these pitfalls and kind of how we approach that. Because you absolutely should leverage Attack. There's a lot of value in that. So the first pitfall I want to talk about is assuming that all techniques are equal. And what I really mean behind this is not necessarily each technique is equal to each other in terms of what they do, because techniques that fall under persistence tactics are completely different from those of discovery or the other tactics. What I really want to talk about is the scope and size of these within the language and the taxonomy of Attack. You have some that are very specific. So for instance, launch agents, MSXSL, MS build, a lot of the ones that fall under execution persistence, they're very specific techniques that have a limited way that you can pretty much implement them in some cases. They're kind of broad there too as well. But it really drives for detection of these pretty simple, not simple, but it's easier to implement detection for these and handle false positives. The aspect here is as we go further and dive deeper into Attack, as we went to map all of our detectors to this framework to kind of align with that, we started seeing things that were very broad. Things like PowerShell is a technique. PowerShell is just a programming language. You can do tons of things with this. To pick on it a little more, you can do almost every tactic with PowerShell if you want. So when we started mapping our detectors to this, we found that we had a ton that fell under PowerShell that also fell under a ton of other techniques, but it's a very broad scope there. So when you think about it from detection and measurement and coverage, it changes how you approach it. So my approach to detection of PowerShell really comes down to what are you doing with PowerShell? What are you doing with that broader technique, and how do you apply it with whatever data sources you are leveraging in your organization? And then we get even broader with some of the techniques that you'll find in Attack. I don't want to pick on supply chain, but I like to pick on file deletion for this purpose, because that's essentially just a function of operating systems in general. Files get deleted. Files get deleted as a part of attack activity in destructive attacks and things like that. So it's valuable from that perspective. When you're looking at it from a response perspective, if I'm dealing with a destructive attack, I want to know what was deleted. It may be important there. So I may want that as context, but I may not create alerts for it or things like that. So you have to really apply that lens and understand that not everything will lead to detection or testability either as we go further. So I like to give away a takeaway for this. And essentially, my point was, what we did was we focused on the most specific things first. So things that we knew we could implement detection for, specifically around alerting and creating events for our analysts. And then we added on to that using the threat model to add context to those. So we then tackled the broader ones. And then as we went through the broader ones, we applied more and more detection to those. So for instance, with PowerShell, we may have focused on like download cradles, and then we focused on obfuscation, or then we focused on like the next thing or the next thing. So we just kind of tackled it one piece at a time instead of trying to do this like broad brush stroke when we went to build detection for different things or map to different things. So I recommend focusing on what's specific to you first, and then increase your scope from there. The second pitfall I want to share with you that we identified was this concept of building an alert for every technique. We got this a lot from customers. Like, do you detect X? Do you detect Y? Do you detect this? Do you detect that? And like, we detect quite a few things. But then as we got those questions about those more broad ones, it became imperative to share with our customers that knowledge of some of these are more applicable in terms of context. Some of these are even more applicable in terms of looking at them from a forensics perspective. So not everything falls into an alert because not every detection technique has to be an alert. Jack Crook is actually from GE, I believe. He's a great resource that I follow quite often, and he likes to talk about looking at things in clusters, clusters of detection techniques. So those more broad ones will lead you to, if you cluster them together, you might be able to generate an alert from there as well. So there's definitely ways you can do that. So I like to kind of bucket them like this. We have our alertable techniques, so ones that we can definitely build alerts for. They're easy to tune if you have the visibility in place and the systems in place to do that. And then you have things that are really important to add context to your events for your analysts. Otherwise, you will flood them. And when you flood them, they get angry. When they get angry, they run you out of the building. So essentially, things like file deletion, super important from a contextual perspective in the case of a destructive attack. Things like directory discovery, attackers enumerating your network. You want to know about it, but you may not want to alert on it because you have scripts that run across 100,000 systems that do this every day, every couple hours, and you'll just start generating events and events and events, and you'll just go through this like tuning rabbit hole. Forensics ones. So not every organization can look at their kernel modules and extensions. Not every organization can at scale look at bootkits and things like that. So those tend to come to light from my experience doing forensic investigation of deep dive things that get spawned from other incidents or other events that we're looking at. And essentially understanding where those fall in line helps you drive your detection strategy, prioritize what's important to you. And one point here, not everything, like Brian mentioned yesterday, about 70–75% of the attack framework is probably testable. The same thing applies to detection. Not everything is an alert. So again, focus on that, providing high fidelity detection, but also enrichment for your analysts so that they're spending less time tuning and churning and more time building more complex detection to tackle some of those harder problems that we all want to face. The third pitfall I want to cover is misunderstanding this concept of coverage. So we hear a lot about it, we talk a lot about it. It's what is your coverage? What do we cover? The leadership asks this question, and it really comes down to explaining what you have coverage for, but also the fact that I think Bryson just mentioned is like there's a limitless possibility of some of the techniques. So what you see is maybe you have a coverage map that's, this is just an example, that has a bunch of green squares and you have coverage for some of these cool things. But as you open the door to each technique, what you really see is that infinite universe of techniques. And behind each door is that universe. And you have to understand that you will build detection and you will have coverage for parts of it. And then you'll just, like a researcher will publish something on Twitter or whatever, and you'll discover something new and you'll go to add to your detection. It's a continuous addition and improvement. And the way we like to track it, and what I want to share with how we kind of do our measurement, we measure everything that we've implemented. So we capture metrics around each of our detector techniques, whether they're generating true positives, false positives, what category of detection that they're generating detections for, how much time analysts are spending on events for that specific detector to help us kind of track, like, is it too broad or too hard to analyze. What can we add from an enrichment perspective to speed that up? Time for us is very important. We want to spend less time on false positives, more time on true positives, and more time building cool things. So the focus there is measure what you have. As you add stuff, include that in your measurements, but don't try to like go for the unknown. Don't try to measure an unknown, like limitless expanding kind of universe. And you'll get more value out of that. And then in terms of like how you share, changing your coverage gaps, as you add new things, inform your stakeholders. Hey, we added these new things. It closes this part of the gap, but we still have this other part of our gap that we have to work on next. And it really drives home that you're continuously improving. And that's the goal at the end of the day, to improve your security. The fourth one I like to share is staying in the matrix. So attack is great. It gives us that language we can talk to. I can talk to anybody on my team using this language. They'll understand it. I can probably explain it to my mom, maybe. But essentially, the point is, it's not all inclusive. It's very comprehensive. There's definitely things that fall outside of attack. There's things that will add to attack over time as this community grows. But the key thing here is here we go. I chose to leverage attack for us, to give us that language to help us improve. Like that's what we did. And the point is, if you stay in the matrix, you'll fall behind in terms of innovation and adversaries, adding new things. Things that get added to attack take time. Models take time to update. Standards take time to update. Remember, not everything is in the language or whatever model you're looking at. So don't let that drive you. You drive it. Feed back to the community. Give back as you find new things. Add them. And that's the goal behind this. And the big thing is make it work for you. Don't rely on it. Make it work for you. Help improve. Drive the community forward and escape that matrix. And then number 5 essentially is forgetting the fundamentals. So as we map to attack and operationalize it, we spent 1.5 years really driving this through. And the big thing is along the way, you get sucked into focusing on attack and focusing on detection and response. But security is much broader than that. There's tons of fundamentals. These are just a few of the many. But essentially, the point is, don't forget about them. Continue to drive what's most important to you and your organization, and drive things forward. Leverage attack where it makes sense. Don't try to fit it into everything. It will fit where it fits, and you'll get great results from that. But again, the point is, find out what the most important aspect for you and your team, your organization, whether you're a detection team, whether you're on infrastructure, compliance, whatever. Find that most important thing, execute on it, move on to the next most important thing, and just make security better as a whole. Questions?
Well, thank you. So we have plenty of time for questions. So we have the throw mic, and I assume we have the throw mic. Over there. New battery. Or just go up to the microphone. Thanks.
So going back to your first pitfall, do you have any suggestions in terms of finding what's specific to an organization? Is it a grunt work of looking at 223 techniques and going one by one, or did you find an easier way to kind of categorize, to risk rank them somehow to say, this is how I'm going to tackle these?
So for us, we focused on our historic detections. So what we were seeing used most, we started there. And then we went down that list essentially. And then in terms of if you're trying to, so that was for mapping. And then for building new things, the way we prioritize is based on a couple things. We try to assign, like, if something we've seen in the wild, we give it a higher likelihood of it being used. Depending on what it is, if there's a high impact, we'll tackle that first. We don't like to use attack to drive each idea. We essentially find all of our ideas, whether we get them from attack or not. We assign that likelihood or that impact rating, and we prioritize that way. And then we just kind of just continuously feed new detectors out.
Okay, thanks. Do we have other questions over there?
Yeah, I had a question about the your third pitfall, misunderstanding coverage.
Yeah.
I fully understand what you mean. Like there's a galaxy behind all these doors, but I would imagine that leadership would like to understand when are we done? When do we do enough? And they like, I think, KPIs that tell when are you at 100%. So have you had to deal with remarks or questions from the leadership like this?
I have, and the reality is there is no end. There is no 100% coverage. There never will be. You have to find that point on each technique or on whatever it is you're working on to find that point at which there's diminishing returns. You can get coverage up to a certain percent, and then it'll cost you like X amount to add that like final 1%. And at that point, you have to make a decision, based on you and your business, whether it's important to go that extra mile or call it for that and then add more on other areas. Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. This may be a little long-winded, or at least it needs a little bit of a lead up for me to explain the question. So in the way that you broke out the matrix into alertable, contextual, and forensic, it seems to me that one of the problems that we may face with the framework itself is that it continues to grow. And in the earlier version of the framework, there was a simplicity in it that made it easier to absorb and understand. In fact, you could literally put it on a single page. Today, I don't think you can put it on a single page. The question really goes to you as well as to the rest of the attack team, which is, I don't think we actually want it to grow in the current format because it will start getting overwhelming to the point where it may resemble something like KPEC, which is very hard to grasp because it's so big. Would we want to consider, and this is a question really for the community, would we want to consider having the attack framework be focused on one of those elements, whether it's the alerting, contextual, or forensic, and then if there is a deeper, pit behind it, be able to capture that in a different framework or different construct. And the reason why I say this is I think there is, to contrast your statement earlier, I think there is a limit that we want to create here. And that limit is based on where we can establish visibility. Once you establish visibility, or rather, if we look at the attack framework as a list of vectors, attack vectors, then the question that's asked is, do I have visibility into those vectors? An attacker can attempt various types of exploits with that vector. So for example, PowerShell is a vector. There's any number of different exploits within PowerShell, right? And we would then look at ways that we can use signature-based or behavioral-based ways to detect specific exploits, but attackers will continually come up with new evasions, right? So that's an endless well, but we don't want to represent that in the framework because it will be endless. But we do want to capture something like PowerShell because that's bounded. So the question is, again, do we want to consider, how do we want to bound the attack framework? Because I think what you're pointing out is that it could, if we don't carefully understand what we're representing in there, it can end up being an unbounded matrix, which I don't think will serve any of us.
I agree on that standpoint. And the way I like to think about it, and this is just kind of how I think about it, is I like to use it as that taxonomy where we can have those bounds, but I also approach it from the understanding that there is a lot of depth to each of the different ones, and it allows us to explain to each other and have that conversation about those tactics and techniques and those implementations without going into this endless matrix. So I think there is a limit. but I don't think there's a limit to what you would consider coverage.
I was just going to ask Blake if he wanted to weigh in on this at all.
Yeah, Sunil is always good for very deep questions. So I think there are things that we can do to help control the growth of attack as it is now. And I mentioned the idea for sub-techniques yesterday, and I think that will help some of the abstraction issues right now so that we're not describing very atomic techniques sort of at the main technique level. So I think that will help a little bit. And I think over time, we'll maybe have to consider some new ideas on how to mitigate growth. But it is something we're very concerned with. We are looking into ways to help with that.
Thank you. Other questions? There.
Thanks for the presentation. Actually, I share a lot of the pitfall that you share. I want to add one, but I want to get your opinion on something like, how do you map machine learning based detection? Because I made a joke that machine learning doesn't know attack framework. In the sense, you can have detection that are based on prevalence, profile, classifier. They don't know anything about attacks, but they still detect things. And how do you map this type of detection to?
Yeah, so we had a similar problem, not with machine learning, but a lot of our behavioral detections are not just on adversarial behavior, they're on just abnormalities with system behavior, like forensic artifacts. So a lot of those are just abnormalities with the system, and they don't really map to some of the techniques specifically. What we did is we just kind of internally created our own labels for some of those and tried to define them internally, and then where they fit with attack, we shared them back with MITRE. But it's again, not all models are perfect. They don't cover everything, and you just have to use them where they fit and make it work for you.
Other questions? So I had one. So I was really interested in looking at your presentation because obviously we're all super gung-ho about attack, but I think we all recognize that there are opportunities for improvement. And so which of, some of the things you talked about are just realities. There's probably not anything we can do as a community except work around them. But if you had to give us, because we have the core attack R&D team, or most of it sitting here in the front row, what would be the 3 areas you'd want us to focus on? Maybe some of them have been mentioned before, maybe they haven't.
Yeah. I think
that we could change, or that we should consider changing in concert with the community.
Right. I think the biggest thing off the top of my head is definitely like sub techniques and having consistency. So back to that point 1, there's a lot of inconsistency in the scope and scale of things. So if we can be more consistent and then have the sub layers for that in an easy to leverage way, I think that'll improve a lot of the usability and kind of inconsistencies. And that may lead to us being able to potentially have better measurement and understanding of measurement and be able to explain that. And then
you don't have to do.
Yeah, I don't know 3. I mean, that's like the biggest one that I've always talked about.
And so sort of to take a look at that, and would you be up to like a refactoring, so like some techniques actually get folded into others and become sub techniques under others? And I'm making this stuff up, and Blake's
that's definitely an option. I think it comes to like all of us as a community to kind of figure that out and to do that. But yeah,
Cool.
I think there's definitely some play there, and we just have to figure out what that is.
I'm just going to ask the folks here. So by show of hands, who here thinks that there's too much unevenness and abstraction in the model at the moment? I'd say that is a majority. And I'm raising my hand. Yeah, and they're raising their hands. So that's great. There's a point. We have a question over there. There's a real important point, which is, we're not done with attack as MITRE, as a community, and as you said, we probably will never be done. So this is about this dialogue. Blake loves to hear how much people love attack and chase them in the mall, but this really is about providing that continuous feedback. Question.
So when I explain the attack framework to people, I explain it as the tactic is the why would an attacker want to do this. The technique is the what is a person actually doing in order to achieve that how. And then sub-techniques or procedures would be the actual mechanism that they're implementing it. It's the how they are doing what they're doing in order to accomplish their why. And I think that there is some degree of divergence in that within the existing matrix, and that causes some confusion. Because there is a differentiation between how someone does it and an indicator. And there's been this temptation to conflate the two because of that disparity in the framework. When I try to apply this across all things, like, for example, PowerShell, not every TTP in the attack matrix has an implicit procedure associated with it. So when I hit those cases where there's not an implicit procedure, that's where things break. So I almost feel like the matrix needs to move up to a point where nothing that's in the matrix has an implicit procedure, that those things are the value of sub-techniques, and that many of the things that don't have an implicit procedure could be consolidated under another more descriptive category, or a what, if you will.
I agree perfectly with that. Like there is definitely a need for more examples in terms of some of the techniques, and then some definitely can either be expanded out or rolled up together.
So we have a question over here, and then we have a question in the back.
Ooh, that was fun. I was also in the NFL. I don't like to brag about it. First off, absolutely love the talk. It's something that I see a lot of people, they think the attack framework will be an easy button for their defenses. It's obviously not. So I'm going to throw this more back to you. Since you do consulting for firms, you've been around. Can you give us some of the stories from the field for what you've seen people have implemented the worst? No names, obviously. No names and shames. Just where are you getting this data from? Just kind of go into some of the stories behind that.
Yeah, so a lot of it comes from just experience from prior consulting engagements, and then being able to, at Red Canary, we see Brian told me earlier, it's 100 terabytes a day of endpoint data. And then we work with our customers in that regard when we find things and just have conversations with them about attack and whatever they're doing in their security program to kind of get their stories as well. And I think like the worst implementation, there's really not a worst, it's just kind of if you're not familiar with using a taxonomy or model or languages like attack, you could fall for the trap of thinking it's and maybe it's because it's in the shape of a periodic table or a matrix. So if you treat it like a periodic table, each thing's its own individual element. But if you look at it like a number of people have is they treat it like this a ruler or a measurement tool. And that's not what it is. And I think that's where the conversation kind of breaks down sometimes. And that's where we kind of direct that.
Question in the back.
Yeah, I can't hear. Okay. Too close. So we've been using the attack framework since about May last year in our operations, and just wanted to weigh in on the behaviors that are in attack. And it's been a great way for us to identify, the actions that an attacker, uses as they progress through the attack, and being able to focus on the behaviors in writing detection that correlate a sequence of behaviors. So you were using PowerShell, for example. So we may have an execution tactic, or excuse me, from the installation tactic, we may choose a technique with that. We may incorporate scripting with PowerShell technique. We may also include credential access or dumping, along with some other techniques, and we all correlate that as a series of behaviors. And then when it comes to writing detection, we look for that set of behaviors to occur within a certain time frame. And in that approach, it's worked very well. And based on how the attack framework has progressed, I don't think it's going to get squirrely or get out of hand. There are certainly quite a bit of techniques that have been developed, but every one that I've seen has fit so far from a detection standpoint and from a language standpoint. Comments?
No, I mean, so that's one definitely great way to approach it is to apply the different techniques where they fit, regardless of what your detection technique is specific for. And I think that's the kind of key point about a language or taxonomy that I like to stress is like you use that language where it matters, and less so of like treating each thing individually. And the way I like to allude to that is like as a snowboard instructor, we have a common language between instructors where we talk about the fundamental movements of a snowboard. We all speak that language when I'm talking to other instructors, but I don't speak that language to children. I distill that down to them. But essentially, having that language helps with that aspect. And I think this is super important for our industry as we grow and expand and build that corpus.
So you touched on this a little earlier, but I wanted to ask kind of for clarification since your presentation is about pitfalls for applying attack.
Yep.
Attack is a language that is fundamentally designed to describe the activities of attackers. Do you see pitfalls in the current trend to attempt to ascribe attack or use attack to describe defensive capabilities or coverage?
I think that it applies to what I think it applies to that describing of attackers fairly well. I think there are aspects of defense that go beyond that, and I'd like to see, like I think Blake mentioned earlier, additional additions to attack, for other aspects of security that are not covered in the current matrix, whether that's cloud or mobile or insider or there's tons of other things. And I think that as we grow as a community and expand upon that knowledge and corpus of that language, everything will start to come into play.
Any final questions? All right. If not, please join me in thanking Kyle.
Thank you.
And I do want to, and I also want to thank you, the audience, for great questions. That's really what we're trying to create here, is a discussion. So we now have two 15-minute breaks, two 15-minute presentations before the break. I'm getting ahead of myself. The first will be given by Scott Lundgren, a founding team member and current chief architect at Carbon Black. Prior to this role, he was Carbon Black's vice president of engineering. And for the past several years, he's been a frequent contributor to the attack framework and OS Query. He's a DerbyCon speaker and a huge believer in open source security capabilities, as well as a Windows internals geek. Scott's also a former pen tester and an offensive security researcher and tool developer. Please welcome Scott Lundgren.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? I dropped off the microphone. I broke it on the way up. So thank you. That was a really overly generous introduction. I understand that I wrote some of that, so we can drop some of the frequents. I don't know where those happened. So I think I have 15 minutes, and I want to talk about the future. And actually, I need the slides sorted in a second when you guys have a second. Right here. And I think I want to step back though for a second, because this conversation we just had is actually really relevant to what I'm going to talk about. And so I'm going to try to play it by ear a little bit and react particularly to Sunil, your question, wherever you went, which really kind of calls into question, what is the, the big picture future of attack, and how do we make sure that we as a community kind of provide a level of rigor to make it successful for all of us in the years to come. So I'm gonna jump to a conclusion here because I only have 15 minutes. I felt like, hey, in the interest of time, instead of building up to a case, I was gonna kind of throw a conclusion out there, right, to try to put a stake in the ground, mostly to inspire a conversation, right? So this is less about an actionable proposal to let's go do something. I want to combine two things. I want to combine attack and I want to combine OS query, but it's really to inspire the conversation, less about walking away from here and saying, hey, let's go do this thing. I want to talk a little bit about, expand on the introduction just so you know where I come from, but I'm not going to do it in the context of what I've done. You can read that. But what I think is really a neat opportunity, and thank you, MITRE, for setting this up, because it turns out each of these 4 bullets that are up here, I've actually worked with someone in the audience in the past, including people I didn't even know. And so I think that's really neat. And so, for example, when John from Microsoft opened yesterday, and he's doing part of the Trustworthy Computing group at Microsoft, and I happen to have been there too, right? And so that was a neat little opportunity to find a bridge. David yesterday from USAA spent some time at the pen testing quadrant in San Antonio, Texas, and I was there too. I didn't know that. That was a neat little introduction. Brian and Bryson both were at the Computer Forensics and Incident Response group at Mantech just down the street. I was there too, so it's a pretty neat little group there. So then before I kind of jump into the proposal, right, I want to make sure you know where I'm coming from, which is very definitely from a position of, just like all of you, right, that attack is absolutely a hugely positive thing for our community. Right? So then I'm gonna propose maybe some shortcomings to kind of jump on Sunil's comments or Kyle's comments, and maybe how we can address them as a future, but it's coming from a position of, hey, I think this is great, I think this is foundational, and I think this is something that makes us all better. And since I was the annoying guy in the back doing the timeline questions, then I'll answer my own question here about timeline. I'm thinking about a multi-year view, right? The rest of this, these 12 minutes is all about a kind of a, what does this look like a year, 2, and 3 from now, and not about what's coming in 3 months. And so I guess, unlike some of the other talks, I'm gonna ask that you kind of relax your mindset and think about, instead of how do I operationalize this tomorrow, instead think about, what does this look like in 2020? All right, so here's the 3 things I'm going to do. I'm going to assert a challenge to the attack framework over the next couple of years. The reason I have to assert it is because I don't have time to build the case. So you're going to have to take my word for it. Then I'm going to introduce OS Query for those of you that aren't familiar with it. And then finally, I'm going to propose a way to bring those 2 together in a conversation that we all can have collectively as a community. So here's the challenge, right? We've hit on this a lot. The idea of identifying adversary tactics in TTPs, it's complicated, right? That's kind of like where we all get stuck in a circle. Kyle just walked us through, hey, attack is no magic bullet. Why? Because the underlying subject matter is complicated. That's just true, and it's not going to go away, and we can't abstract that away. So given the complication, it's easy for, as people come and go, right? Maybe the MITRE team right here come and go over the next few years, or maybe just our community comes and goes. The message has a chance to get diluted, right? What attack means can be diluted. And what we don't want is the attack name to be damaged, right? Or people lose faith in what it stands for or what it means. And therefore, we have to kind of, as a community, restart the cycle and come up with something new. There's no reason for that, right? We have something positive we can build on. And so you take that technical complexity and the fact that it is from a vendor perspective, and I'm obviously speaking here as a member of that community, it's a competitive marketplace and you get a lot of cross messaging and it's a messy business, right? That's a challenge. That's what I'm asserting as a challenge. And what I would like to do is be able to provide the foundational support within attack itself and the framework and the ecosystem around it to make it strong enough to withstand that challenge. Now I'm going to entirely switch gears. Right, so just pause that whole conversation, entirely switch gears, and we're going to talk about an unrelated project called OS Query. And so what I'm going to ask, just so I have a sense of the room, is what percentage of people would you say have some reasonable understanding of what OS Query is? So perfect is exactly half. So then I kind of have to do the introduction, right? This slide is out of order somehow, which is great. So let's come back to it. So what is OS Query? So OS Query is an open source project. It's on GitHub, github.com/Facebook/OS Query. It's originally developed by Facebook, surprisingly enough, with the idea of securing Facebook.com, right? So this is the actual cloud infrastructure that is backing Facebook.com, obviously a huge environment. And so, the underlying decision at Facebook was, hey, we want better manageability and telemetry across that massive fleet of servers, Linux. And we have very specific requirements, efficiency matters, and so we're going to build it in-house. And what started as like a simple little homegrown project turns into something much bigger. We call it OS Query. Over time, it has been ported to run on Mac and Windows, and also even BSD. So it's cross-platform, it's open source. And then a key point here is that it's extensible. So extensibility is built into it. It itself, and I'll describe what it is in a second, ships out of the box, it works, it's great. But then you all, right, or anyone has the ability to either contribute directly to the core or to extend it with your own extensions that you may or may not choose to open source. Those are kind of the key characteristics. So what is it? So for those of you who don't know, you can think about it as an endpoint telemetry agent right? Something that runs on an endpoint on an operating system and allows you to get information about that endpoint. And the interface is in the form of SQL, which is odd because there's no actual database under the hood. It's an asterisk on that, but for this conversation, it's good enough. So there's no database under the hood. Instead, SQL is the language by which you can choose to query. And so you can say things like, hey, show me via select statement, show me a list of all running processes across my entire fleet. You can also say, hey, show me all my open sockets. That'd be equivalent of like a net stat across my fleet. And because of the power of SQL, you can actually join those tables arbitrarily, right? Select, mix and match, limit, sort, etc. So SQL is just a language that many of us are familiar with. It's an easy way to interface, and so it's a neat little idea. So hopefully that kind of gives you a sense of what OS query is. Ultimately, think about it as a way to query telemetry with an endpoint agent that's already built in, it's cross-platform, and it's open source. So then the conversation. So I'm going to go back to the slide that was out of order. Forgive me for a second. One more. Great. So Brian got up yesterday and said, hey, about the testing framework, the Atomic Red Team framework, that's really cool stuff. It's open source. It meets the same kind of, in my opinion, it meets the same kind of design goals and kind of spiritual or emotional tenets of MITRE itself, the attack framework itself, rather. It's open, it's approachable, it's sensible, it's simple, it breaks it down. And the testing framework is a really powerful part of the ecosystem. I think we can agree on that. I certainly agree with that. A question that I heard yesterday was, how do I even tell if my testing framework is working? Right, so what am I testing? Well, I'm testing the entirety of my defense infrastructure, right? So I might have some commercial products, I might have some open source projects, some homegrown stuff, and I can run a testing framework and I can find out whether or not things are working, and then if it doesn't, where did it break, right? And troubleshooting that can become complicated. And so what I'm propose, this is the conversational part, what I'm propose is talking about how do we as a community kind of decide of the elements, the TTPs within the attack framework that are actionable, the ones that fit within the 70% that Brian asserted were the ones that were concrete enough to write firm detections. What would it look like to have a canonical community-generated repository of reference detections, right? They don't have to be necessarily the ones you put in production. They may not be manageable enough. They may not be efficient enough. They may not be performant enough. They may not be right for your org for any number of reasons. But at least we have a reference set of detections that we can say, hey, we know it's possible technically to winnow down what it means to detect this technique. We know what it looks like. We can see at a high level what that looks like. We can dive all the way down to the source code it takes under the hood to see that detection. And we can say, hey, as a line in the sand, we know what that means. So this kind of, without any arrows, is what I'm calling a three-legged stool, right? As a part of a larger ecosystem. Clearly, the attack framework itself is the centerpiece, the first among equals, right? That's why we're all here. But around that, right, we've already talked about the testing frameworks, which I have in the bottom left, right? And now maybe add to that in the ecosystem a set of reference detections. So then first things first, I'm hardly the first person that thought of this. In fact, there's plenty of people that have already been doing it and doing a great job. And that was prior to my ever coming up with the idea for this talk or even having this conversation in my head. So they deserve all that credit. I'll provide three here. Filippo Muttini, who's not here, out of Italy, has been doing this, it turns out, with OS Query itself. I'll describe that in a second. Olaf, I believe, from the Netherlands, has done this with some Sysmon configs, really incredible work with Sysmon from Microsoft. And then the firm Polylogics, which I have no affiliation with of any type, has done some interesting work in terms of open sourcing some additional extensions to OS Query to provide similar type of capabilities. So this stuff already exists. This is just some of what's already out there. What I'm proposing, right, and this is a conversation rather than like a direct proposal again. What I'm proposing is saying, hey, let's have a conversation maybe about standardizing as a community on what that means, right? So these people, these individuals I just described and others are doing great work in terms of providing reference detections and making them available. That's great, but they're scattered, it's inconsistent, and it's difficult for me to map from a TTP entry in the framework directly to a reference detection. I can't find that in a centralized way. And so the conversation that I'm hoping to have, right, is, and maybe here, right, maybe somewhere else, maybe over time, I told you about the multi-year view, right, but ultimately to say, hey, is that something we want to do? Is that something that provides value? And if it does, how do we go about doing it? And the reason why I kind of asserted the OS query link, or as a ways to achieve that end was because, again, in my opinion, as an individual, the openness of it, the cross-platform nature of it, the fact that it's extensible, all these attributes are consistent with the attack framework ethos, in my opinion, and they're accessible to all of us to work on as a community that is not specific to a vendor or specific to an organization. In the top right there, I have a select star from, right? So I picked at random. I used the throw the dart, kind of roll the dice. I think that was the analogy, right? So the roll the dice analogy. So I picked at random a technique, and you can, and I didn't put any output there because I haven't written any code. I haven't done any actual work, right? But what I did show you there is you can imagine a scenario where, hey, I'm looking at a certain technique. I can read about it. I can understand it conceptually. I even see a whole series of links to reference materials elsewhere on the internet that describe how it works. And then in one simple query, right, with code that I can read and extend and arbitrarily change and send to my friends, I can see how that might be detected in the real world. I think, to Sunil's point, wherever he went, right, in my opinion, having that forcing function for a standard way to do a reference detection provides a way to segment each of the TTPs within the framework into things that can be clearly detected, the things that fit in the 70% that Brian asserted, and things that are much more difficult to detect, supply chain, et cetera, right, that we've talked about. And that itself provides a way to start having conversations about further segmenting the framework itself to make it more accessible over time. How do I look at things that I can detect, and how do I split off those that are probably more conceptual, abstract? This is my last slide. So to me, if what I'm proposing has any merit, right, then what I'd like to see would be over the coming weeks or months, right, that we have some sort of a conversation about this, not me as the focal point necessarily, right, but a way to, as a community, to have a conversation about this. I'd like to know, right, your thoughts collectively, like, hey, is this something that is valuable, that does it resonate at all? Ultimately, what I hope you take away from all of it, right, is that the intention, the reason why I'm up here talking about it is because I want to provide a mechanism to add a little bit more rigor and structure around the ecosystem as a whole, so that we can feel confident that the attack framework is going to be here for the years to come, right? That was my opening statement. I think it's super valuable for all of us. I think we all agree with that. So how do we kind of protect it and nurture it, right, so it's in a good place for years to come? And that is the entirety of the presentation.
Great. We have time for a question or two. Giving you folks a chance. So I'll ask, oh, we have one?
Yep.
Hey,
Mic check.
I don't know if anybody can hear me. All right. So awesome presentation. I think that you're going to find some parallels here, that there have been parallels throughout the day in the presentations. What hashtag should we use to discuss this?
That's the best question of the day. Since you put me on the spot and I don't have an answer, what if I reverse it and make you pick one?
You must be
I'm enabling.
I think maybe, I don't know, ATT&CKcon will turn it into blockchain, really hype it up, you know?
That's great. That's it. All right, so it's a fair question, right? So I will be, since I was willing to stick myself out here on this one, right? Then I'll tweet out, you saw my Twitter handle, it's 529, you'll see it in the presentation. I'll tweet out something with a proposal, and then we'll go from there. Is that fair?
Awesome, yeah.
Any other questions?
Would false positives be incorporated into a testing framework like that? Like downing software that we know does something like MSHTA or whatever.
Yeah, so I think the question is hey, if there's a reference detection that's generic, right, how do you build in, like, in effect, the common false positives at least, right, to make that, my opinion, right, the answer is yes for the common stuff, right? I'm not, in my opinion, the kind of the reference detection implementation is not about a production-ready system. That's what, you know, vendors and other projects and homegrown stuff have the ability to do. but it is about kind of making it accessible and better for learning, right, and understanding. So I think, yeah, like being able to weed out the most common stuff is yes, but then after that, I would say stop, and ultimately because I want to make it, in my opinion, simple and approachable for people who are new to the field and not get bogged down in a, kind of a massive list.
Question over there.
I think a reference implementation needs or assumes that there is also a reference environment. And what I mean by that is you have monitoring on endpoint, you have monitoring on network, et cetera. Is part of your proposal that we build that as well? Or how do you account for a situation where maybe I don't have those tools in that environment?
Are you asserting that endpoint environment is high entropy and lots of complications?
That's a fair statement, yes.
Yeah, in a perfect world, absolutely, right? I think I understand the magnitude, I guess, of what I'm proposing in terms of the amount of work and the fact that it's not exactly obvious who is going to do it, other than apparently Brian, who's willing to just do everything. I think ideally, yes, I think I would like to tie it to something like a testing framework so that there's a commonality there, right? So you could expect the testing framework to fire and the detection, of course, to work, and it would all be paired off. In terms of dependencies and environments, yeah, there have to be some canonical way to represent that.
So Sunil, we have time for one really quick question and a quick answer.
So earlier we saw EQL, and I don't know if the Red Canary folks are here, but it seems to me that what you're proposing, which is great, is somewhere manifested in EQL. So I would argue that maybe we can ask Red Canary to make that compatible with OS Query in some sort of way. And if they're not, then I would suggest some sort of death match between your proposal and theirs.
I think we just skip right to the death match.
Yeah, I guess the big thing to point out is that that was an end game. We call it event query language, but I guess the biggest thing for us, which is awesome, is we've been really struggling with the desire in the community to get that out publicly. So if the ask is just to get something like that out there, maybe that's a start. But yeah, point noted. That's awesome.
Great. And so please join me in thanking Scott. So next up is a short presentation from James Leroux, the leader of the behavior research team at Veridin. Previously, James was the chief of security operations for the executive office of the president at the White House. His other positions have included founding the DIA Computer Network Defense Center Defensive Countermeasures Team, Enterprise Countermeasures Lead at the U.S. Cyber Command, and Section Manager at the NSA CSS Threat Operations Center. Please welcome James Leroux.
I have the slide remote, or is it up here? Oh. Right on top. Hey, so good morning. This whole ATT&CKcon has been really awesome. I've heard a lot of people talk in similar to veins of what I've been thinking. So, you know, it's great to hear that because that means that there's probably something to the way that I'm thinking, and that, you know, it's just awesome to organize the community in this way. So did a pretty good job introducing myself. Really, what kind of keeps me motivated in the security space lately, right, is to try to take cybersecurity from kind of a black art where you just throw some money at it and hope something happens to like more of like a regular business unit. And I think that we're on the right track here with discussions about measurement and I've heard like scientifically and all that kind of keywords here today. And really, like, at the end of the day, my motivation is we should be able to go to a C-level suite and say, hey, here is my plan. I think we're weak here. Here's the action that I can take, and this is the expected result. So they're going to want things like, what is your expected result? And right now, we're kind of the only business unit that can say, like, it's green, or like, we think it'll make it better. I heard this guy say that he really likes this firewall. and even notoriously kind of difficult areas where, like advertising, for example, if you go Fortune 500 board and you're pitching an advertising campaign, they're going to want like a forecast of what the result is going to be, right? So that's kind of my motivational end and why I've been working on the things that I have. So real quick, I'm a new father, so I'm obligated to practice dad jokes. So I have the opportunity here. So time flies like an arrow, fruit flies like a banana. Gets stuck in your head, sorry. So hybrid analysis, who's familiar with it? Probably a lot of people. But basically it is a public sandbox that anybody really can upload whatever they want. Some very light registration, you can get a lot of data. Their API is great. You don't have to pay them a whole bunch of money to get a lot of really good information. So a few months back, shortly before the call for papers, they started introducing something where attack tactics would get reported on along with all the rest of the malware report. And I thought that was really interesting because as part of that bringing a level of rigor and scientific method and all that kind of good stuff, I believe that that kind of common framework that the last talk was talking about on detections is kind of necessary. What keeps me up at night about attack is more, hey, I have this coverage. We have red, yellow, green. Well, a lot of that we've heard is based off of people huddling together and decomposing what those APT strategies are. And then maybe devising a couple tests. That's great work. It's a lot of work for just one APT group. So I think about like, how can we scale this? So how can we apply this kind of line of thinking on a machine level, really? Because the machine is much more consistent than you are as far as categorization. If I take the same APT group and give you like an incident report and malware, and then I give it to somebody else, chances are you're not going to come up with the exact same attack tags. So that's a consistency problem, because when you take that report that you've built and have that red, yellow, green heat map that you're bringing and presenting to your executives, Executive A might get a picture of, hey, we are really great at preventing lateral movement. Well, you only tested one thing, or maybe you didn't test, maybe you tested one method of a technique. Whereas somebody else might be like, okay, well, we're yellow, but you know, we tested different things. There's not like a mutual understanding of what that test encompasses. So if those two top level guys were to talk to each other, they're gonna say like, well, crap, mine is yellow and yours is green. How'd you do that? And like, really, it might be a complete deception, really, because your yellow is maybe more accurate than that one green test that you ran. So that's why I like computers to do that hard stuff for us. So really, a lot of this talk is about that consistency aspect. And if we can't do those measurements consistently, we're really not producing a report that is like actionable, in my opinion, or at least actionable on the, hey, I'm gonna spend $20 million as a result of your findings. Like, if I'm a CEO or on the board or whatever, I want a lot more than like, you think that it's yellow, cool, show me like how you came up with that. And like, if it doesn't pass the middle school science level test, then I'm gonna be a little bit concerned that my money isn't gonna actually go as far as you say it's going to. So you can see consistency is a very big part. You know, the Steve Jobs quote up there, if you want to use a framework to make educated decisions, it better be consistent. Well, you didn't say that. I did, sorry. But I'll steal his credibility for now. You got to use the adversary's technique sometimes. So when hybrid analysis started doing some of these attack taggings, technique taggings, I used their awesome API to go and like scrape a bunch of stuff. The title here is 200. I mean, this could easily be way more. But what I'm doing here is I'm going to take my top 5 and kind of see if we can get some insight into how they're doing things. So off the bat, execution, right? Service execution is the most common. Okay, maybe that's reasonable. And WMI is up there at 16. What's missing here for me is like the exploit client side application, I think it is, because that covers like all crimeware almost, like any drive-by exploit that's going to be there. You have a malicious flash file that's there. So we're not seeing that, which is kind of telling. And I don't know if that is because they don't have a detection on the back end. I suppose that they're probably using something along the lines of Yara, but I don't know, right? Moving on to persistence. Well, here's a big problem. The items that I submitted were all pretty much Windows executable. So why is a Linux and Mac tactic number 1, or technique, excuse me. So that's a problem. That back-end signature, or whatever it is they're using to classify that, needs to be adjusted probably. And look, this isn't truly trying to beat up on them or anything like that. I've seen things change in how they're doing this over time, and they are making improvements constantly. On the discovery side, like this should be a really interesting one because discovery kind of covers both the network side and the host side. So a lot of people have been talking about how attack is not a linear thing. Well, if I'm doing host-based discovery, that's like a huge category. If I'm doing network-based discovery, that's a huge category. So we should see quite a bit of different techniques here, and we kind of do, which is positive. On the collection side, email collection is like way bigger than I thought it would be. I mean, it's still 30 out of 200, but how much malware, you have to keep in mind that the subject of this is executables. So how many pieces of malware are just automatically without any C2 interaction going to be collecting malware and getting it ready for exfil right off the bat? I mean, I'm sure there's some pieces of malware that do that, but is it 30? I don't know. Command and control is kind of the same way. Again, this is a sandbox. I'm sure they can do some limited command and control interaction. It's also notable that like, hey, commonly used protocol isn't on there. Now, I can guess that it's got to be difficult to sort out what is part of actual C2 and what is like, hey, I'm just doing a DNS check for my home base where, you know, where you register our product or whatever, right? Or to load some kind of resource within the artifact. So that would be really difficult to kind of cut down on those sort of false positives. So if we back out, really, what we're seeing is, okay, there's some decent coverage here. This is all the items are green or techniques that I saw during my analysis, and red doesn't have anything. You know, but like it's a decent start. Anybody who's tried to do this sort of thing, it's not easy, right? So ultimately, this kind of circling back to, we need a way to have a common agreement on how to categorize artifacts and behaviors in an automated way. Because you might look at this and say like, hey, that's not very good, right? But I can guarantee you that if you run this like a week from now with the same configuration, you're going to get the same results. And I can compensate in my reporting for problems along that line. I can't compensate in a report that you felt like, you know, somebody cut you off on the way to work and somehow that changed the way you think and you now classify something differently. So I think it's important, and this is really kind of one of those call to action things, for us to kind of agree upon all that good stuff and all the how we want to classify artifacts. And even if it doesn't cover 100%, we need to agree upon that. Otherwise, we're going to get to a point where dirty vendors like me, well, not me, but are basically going to start rigging the system. So they're going to say like, we have 100% coverage. I mean, that's going to be the reality of it. And if we can't go back and say like, okay, show me the data that you're using, show me how you're classifying everything, and let's bubble that up. If you can't do that, you shouldn't basically trust that overall report. So, and I'm not saying that anybody's doing anything wrong, but like you can be misleading your leadership if you're reporting on something that is based off of a feeling, right? We need to take this seriously and be able to actually measure the artifacts. So this is a dialogue, and I look forward to any questions, and let's figure out whatever that hashtag is.
Yeah, I made a proposal to Katie. So we have time probably for one question. One question for James. Going once, going twice.
Glad I explained everything.
Absolutely. All right, then please join me in thanking James. So before you get out of your seats, just a couple announcements. We're going to take a 30-minute break. Just like yesterday, you're going to get a chance to vote at the matrix right out here in the hallway. The question we're going to be voting on this morning is, with your attack mapped detections, which ones generate the most true positives? So which ones are generate the most true positives? In addition to voting on the matrix, we have some Sharpies out there. If you're interested, this is really for our benefit. If you'd like to just sign your name or whatever on it, we're going to keep that as a memento and display it somewhere here in MITRE McLean. So we'd appreciate that if you're interested. Make sure you check out the snack attack. Today it is a trail mix bar. And finally, a bunch of you took the opportunity yesterday to talk to John Wonder about how you're using attack in your environment. Please, John will be out there during the break and at lunch. Please take advantage of that and tell him your story about attack. And we'll look forward to seeing everyone back here at 11:15 sharp. Thanks. Welcome back. So welcome back to everyone here in McLean and those of you online. If we could all get seated so we can stay on schedule. I don't think it's a shock to say that many of us here are passionate about attack and how we're going to use it in our environments, or how we are using in our environments. And our next speakers really embody this ideal. Roberto Rodriguez is a senior threat hunter at SpecterOps, where he specializes in the development of analytics to detect advanced adversaries' techniques. His experience performing incident response and threat hunting motivated him to help organizations improve their security posture and to share his knowledge with the information security community. He is the author of several open source projects, such as the Threat Hunter Playbook and HELK, to aid the community development of techniques and toolings for hunting campaigns. His co-presenter is his brother, Jose Luis Rodriguez, a student at Northern Virginia Community College, where he just started his associate degree in cybersecurity. His background in business intelligence and data science for large organizations in Peru motivated him to apply his experience here in the cybersecurity industry, and he is also a frequent contributor to open source projects. Please welcome Roberto Rodriguez and Jose Luis Rodriguez.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much, everybody. Can you guys hear me? Well, okay. And first, I would like to say thank you to the attack team for giving us the opportunity to be part of the first ATT&CKcon, and also, of course, to be able to speak with my brother for the first time. And The topic today is going to be hunters attacking with the right data. So the focus or talking about hunting is going to be focusing a little bit into how we can start using what attack provides from a data perspective, and then start mapping things to what we're collecting already in our environment. And we were already presented, part of the Spectre Ops team, and the GitHub link is there. So if you want to contribute, please, I would love to talk to you and brainstorm a little bit how we can do things better. And also a former Capital One senior threat hunter.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jose. I go by CyberPanda in Twitter. Very happy to be here with you. This is my first conference. And also a funny thing about this is that my first cybersecurity word that I learned in January when I came here to the States was attack. And I'm also a former senior business intelligence analyst from UNACEM Peru.
All right, so the agenda for today is going to be talking about what we are seeing, or what I'm seeing most of the time in organizations, from a threat hunting, from data perspective, from attack as well, all the way to start showing you how we start mapping things, specifically event logs to attack data sources, show you a couple examples at the end how that works. So from a threat hunting and data perspective, I see that every organization has its own procedures. They want to do their own things, they put together their own programs, and it's great. But at the same time, I see that the focus on data is not as important as I believe it should be. Data, as we know, first is growing, it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And if we don't start documenting our data, understanding what that actually means, what that provides to us, and finding relationships in there, it's going to be hard to start hunting. It doesn't matter how good your program might be. You might be hunting in a data swamp rather than in a data lake, which is what we all intend to do, right? We all try to buy these tools, try to put them together, but at the end of the day, it might not be an ideal situation. So more data, more problems. I think that some of you might be thinking about this, but the reality is that more data gives you enough visibility, right? From a hunting, from an IR perspective, but you have to start prioritizing what you collect. You have to start understanding what you have. And the first question of like, what data do you have in your environment? Most of the time, of course, is answered by, I do know where my data comes from. I do know my logs, where they come from. But the second question, do you really know your data, the data that you're collecting? That's a different question, right? Do you understand the meaning of the logs that you're collecting? And of course, at the end, we can start going back into this conversation, but do you really know your data, right? So this is the whole idea of this presentation. We all know why we're here. Right? Attack provides a lot of information, great relationships across all the data that they put together. But I believe that we're still missing that piece from the extra metadata that attack provides that we love the most, which is the data sources piece. And if we define data sources from MITRE perspective, just to summarize this thought, is that it's the information that you collect from the sensors and things that you have in your environment, all the way to the perimeter level, that is going to allow you to validate the detection of a specific technique. So when you start understanding this, you start then creating these extra relationships in this beautiful first relationship that they put together in their paper, with the main goal to start mapping things that you have all the way to a technique, to an adversary, and things like that. Now, this is easier, right? Because you can just say, this tool gives me this, I bought this vendor, it's giving me this. So you can do this. So your question might be right now, then why we keep talking about data and how we can map it to MITRE ATT&CK? The main goals is that what we want to do in here is to expand on the attack data sources. We want to help prioritize how we can start collecting data, still map it to an attack data source, but in order to be more efficient doing that, we need to understand how pretty much we can talk about our data, understand it a little bit better. At the end of the day, we want to define a methodology, how we do this, in order to help blue teamers and also red teamers to understand what an adversary actually look like in the environment. And of course, we want to share how we learn about event logs and also data sources. So let's define our methodology. We're going to go all the way from exploring attack data sources to start validating these data mappings and, of course, sharing our methodology. Let's explore attack data sources. You might be asking yourself how I do this. And there are different ways to do it, right? You can do it through the website. You can do it through the GitHub repo. But the one that I like the most is to do it via their public taxi servers, using their APIs to then access the data in sticks format. So we built this library on the top of the two other MITRE libraries that were out there for the community. The reason why I built mine was because I wanted to keep the same naming convention that you see on the website when I collect all this data, because the sticks tend to change a little bit, the names and all the stuff. And instead of calling it a technique, you might be calling it this attack pattern. So that's why I like to keep things more consistent. That's the only reason why I built this tool. This tool can be installed. This is just for reference for you guys. You can do it via pip from source. And then after you do that, you can use Jupyter Notebooks to start manipulating the attack data sources and all the information that you get from attack. And as you can see, it was just updated yesterday. After the big updates, some of the things broke in my scripts. So I had to do it again and update it. But actually, that helped a lot for our next conversation, because we were able to put together an updated Jupyter Notebook with the latest numbers from MITRE ATT&CK, especially from a data source perspective.
Yeah. So after updating our Jupyter Notebook, we found 478 techniques. Most of them, actually 259, do not have data sources. And this might be an opportunity for us to collaborate with the attack team, or maybe because some of them do not happen inside your environment where your security tools are collecting data.
Yep.
Now, so if we group all these techniques with and without data sources by matrix, we can see on the graph on the right that all the techniques without data sources, most of them belong to the pre-attack and the mobile attack matrices. Now, something interesting that we found here is that there are 4 enterprise techniques that do not have data sources. So if you were looking for something to do this weekend, this is the list of the 4 techniques that do not have data sources.
Collaboration right there.
Yeah.
If you really wanted to do something this weekend, there they are. Yep.
Now, let's focus only on those techniques that do have data sources. So the majority of these techniques are covered by 3 data sources: process monitoring, process command line, and file monitoring. So this might be a good start if you want to prioritize your data collection process. Another interesting thing at looking this graph is that there are some data sources names that are related to the Windows platform. So let's analyze these Windows data sources and analyzing every data source that is mapped to a specific technique. We can see that some of them are related to non-Windows platform. So we need to be careful if we want to map a specific data source to a specific technique, to a specific platform. There might be some information that doesn't make sense. Now, going back to our graph, some of you might be prioritizing your data collection by considering the data source that covers most of the techniques of the attack framework. But do we really need only one data source to validate the detection of a specific technique? Well, our next graph will help us to understand or to answer this question. According to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, only 19 techniques require one data source. So the other 200 techniques require at least 2 data sources. So the number of data sources for us is related to how much context you need to validate the detection of a technique. So we are not talking about just only one data source. We're talking about groups of data sources. Now, here is the list of the top 15 groups of data sources that the attack team recommends to work together in a specific technique. So as you can see here, the top process command line, process monitoring, and file monitoring belong to the top 4. Now, we know that we were talking about these data sources before, but now we are not looking at them just one by one. We are looking at them as a group of data sources. So, for example, with file monitoring, process command line, and process monitoring, and process command line, and file monitoring, you can start analyzing at least 37 techniques.
Right. That has to be as a group and not just as one, which is the main point in here.
And this can be another way to prioritize your data collection process.
All right. So once we learn a little bit into what attack actually provides to us from a data source perspective, then we want to start documenting some of the things now that we have in our environment. Let's pick this technique right here, T1214, credentialing registry. We do have these attack data sources already defined for you. The first step, you might be already saying, okay, if I want to detect this, at least to validate the detection of this technique, I'm going to use 4688 because that maps to a process creation. But the reality is that there is other events that are part of process monitoring. In this case, 4689. You might have other data sets such as Sysmon with process creation. They give you more information that probably 4688 might provide to you, all the way up to, for example, a process accessing a process. So the main goal in here is to understand what you are getting from the data rather than say, oh, this gives me a process. And then you say, cool, so we're checked. No, you have to understand how that actually works. And in order to do that, the main step in here is to start creating data dictionaries. You have to understand exactly what each event field provides to you. And in this case, we have the event ID 1, so you have some ideas. This came from also a research from red teamers. Spectre Ops, Matt Graber, and Lee Christensen, they talked about a Black Hat, how they were able to document what Sysmon provided to them. And they were able to see which specific event fields were a higher attacker influence rating. So these are the specific event fields that they were sharing that they could manipulate and pretty much own. So that's very important. So if they are doing it, we should be doing it as well, if I haven't convinced you yet, to start documenting your data. The next step is to build a data model once you document all this stuff. This is because we want to define the structure of the data, and we want to find relationships among all these different data sets. And MITRE started their own data model, and those are the links for car analytics and also the specific cyber observable objects that they use, information. So if you want to understand it a little bit more, go to those links. You're going to have a lot of information. Most of our research is based on that as well. So when you start talking about data modeling, you might be thinking from a database perspective, okay, conceptual all the way to physical. So basic entity relationships all the way to specific data types that you use to store your data. Okay, so that's for those that have that knowledge. But this also applies to cyber threat intelligence, all the way from a relational database perspective to some graphing that you can do with data from CTI. And from here, you can then go deeper and start getting information such as properties or specific adversary attributes and things like that. So why can't we do that with event logs? We can start then pulling file, a process, a registry, a pipe. And then to that, there are going to be relationships among these specific data objects. You're going to find properties, attributes to these specific data objects. And if you document your data, you might find specific relationships already defined for you that you have to use in order to do these correlations. We're talking about join queries. We're talking about sequences of events. You have to document your data and start modeling so you understand what that actually looked like. The idea at the end is to start building something like this, where Sysmon can be, instead of showing all these beautiful event IDs, now you can start showing that in a relationship way between a process, creating a process, a registry, a file, connecting to a pipe. So you have to be able to understand your data this way, because this is going to help you later to build your data analytics.
Okay. So after documenting all the relationship between our data objects, we can start defining sub-data sources that will help us to, that will give us more details and information about each attack data source, and will give us the relationship between an attack data source and a data model.
So after that, you can start backing up each specific sub-data source. We're talking about sub-techniques, but I believe that in order to accomplish that, you have to understand how the data will define what it is that you can detect. So in here, we can pretty much apply our basic model and start putting together what a sub-data source actually means from a logic perspective. And at the end, you can do the same thing with Windows Registry, for example. And something very interesting here is that that's what Sysmon provides to you, right? Process to a registry. But Sysmon does not give you user to a registry relationship. You have to do that with security event logs. So that's very important, because you might just be stuck in here, and then when you try to come up with this next analytic to start identifying users doing all these behaviors, you won't be able to do it with Sysmon. So you have to understand what events are going to provide that to you. The idea at the end is to start creating this whole mapping, right? And before, we were talking about all the way from a technique to attack data sources to sub-data sources with this specific model. Then once I do this, then this to me makes sense. It's not anymore based on feelings, based on expertise, and saying, I know this tool gives me this. Yeah, I work with this. We're covered with registry. You buy this tool, we're good. They say that they cover process monitoring. Wait a minute. What specific sub-data sources of my process monitorings are you covering? Are you covering only process creation, or you're going all the way to a process accessing a process? Correct?
So going back to our top 15 groups of data sources, let's pick the second one, which contains file monitoring and process monitoring. This pair of data sources are together in at least 68 techniques. So applying our methodology, you can see here the relationship between an attack data source, sub-data sources, and event logs. Now, the question here is, do we need to collect all these event logs? So the answer is it depends of the variation of the technique that you are analyzing. So in this case, for example, we are only considering 4 sub-data sources and 4 event logs. And this, for us, is a good example of being effective in our data collection process.
Yep. So the idea at the end, I know that a lot of you might not like Excel sheets, right? But this is very easy to keep track of just with an Excel sheet. If you want to now be a little bit more dynamic and start using some like text search functionality on the top, I can push this to an L stack and just give it to you, which is going to happen after this presentation. I was thinking about that. I was like, how can I not show a spreadsheet and show an elastic dashboard? So this is going to be available in OSAM. This is our new logo, by the way, because we love animals. So we like to put together like a little logo for each project that we work on. And this is going to have data dictionaries, the whole data model aspect, attack data sources mapped to specific event IDs and things like that, but not just the direct relationship between attack data source and event ID. We're going to show you what happens between that relationship and why we believe it should be that way. We have at least, I think, 100 event logs with relationships that we have in there, and that's going to keep growing and growing. And of course, with the community involvement, that'll be nice to expand it. So we're going to show how that's actually helpful for your threat hunting operations. Everybody has their own procedures, once again, right? There is different ways that you can do this, but this presentation focused a lot into where data might fit. And I think that what we talked about in here from a documentation and data modeling perspective happens before you even build your data analytics, because you have to understand what it is that you need before you build your data analytics. And this happens, of course, after a simulation. So for those great companies like Endgame and Red Canary building their own simulation tools, it's awesome because you can then have that data, model it, document it, and then build your data analytics. And before you execute a hunt, you have to then, with that information, do some type of completeness, data quality assessments. How much data do I have now that I want to go in production? That will define how successful you will be in your threat hunting engagements. So keep that in mind when you talk about data. Make it a big point in your program. Think about it, document it, and it will be really helpful. So we're going to do one example in here, and we're going to pick pass the hash. That was actually perfect to be here, because I can point it out. And pass the hash in general, just the basics is how you can authenticate to a resource by using just a hash or a key, so without typing your credentials. And there is some variations. There's one called overpass the hash. This is just based on Kerberos authentication. I'll talk to you a little bit in my 1-minute definition of what it is. Actually, less than a minute. And then it's just based on tickets and keys. And then the idea here is how you can take a hash of a password and then upgrade it to a ticket. It's going to make sense in a little bit. So Kerberos authentication in here, the basics, you type your password, it gets hashed, multiple keys get created depending on the functionality of your domain. You can take that hash or that key and then request a ticket. You get the ticket because they validate that it is who you say you are, that you are who you say you are. And then with that ticket, you can access other service tickets to access other resources like a file share, things like that. That's the basics of Kerberos authentication. There is, of course, more about this. Overpass the hash avoids the first step, which is do not provide, they don't provide the clear text password. If the attacker steals that hash or that key, they can do this whole requesting of a ticket, then getting a service ticket and things like that. So let's just take a look at Mimikatz because they can do that, right? And this is not new. This has happened a long time. I actually did a blog post about this. And what it does, it creates a new process with fake credentials. Then it patches LSAS with the key that it stole. And then you can start pretty much impersonating and accessing resources that the user's key actually has access to. So in this demo, we have Mimikatz, we have our account Pedro, it's actually my dog's name, and we have a hash, and we have a target. This is the victim, and it's running as admin, and we have the target. And if we pretty much check who we are, right, we're just basic C Brown, it's just another user, and if we try to access the domain controller or just any other server that the user does not have access to, access deny, basic stuff. But then what I can do is start using Mimikatz over past the hash in order to access these resources that I want, because now I have Pedro's hash. So we just copy and paste that command, and then we can see that first a fake process gets created, fake credentials are there first, then the hash gets patched to LSASS. So now if we do another who am I in this process, we still see Brown, we're still the user. But now if we try to access the domain controller again, for example, then we can see that it was successful. So this attack is very interesting, right? Because you can just impersonate somebody without using those credentials. And let's just start using this methodology a little bit. So we start getting all these event logs, and in this case, we're getting a process calling a service with privilege, with specific service privileges. We can see LSASS doing the same thing, and in this case, it's because LSASS is getting ready to start managing this Kerberos authentication. We see a user authenticating to a host locally. It's because C Brown now has a new logon process with other credentials that are going to be used over the network. So we have C Brown, and then we have Pedro there, that the moment the user accesses a resource on the network, then it's going to use Pedro's credentials. And then, of course, what Mimikatz does best, access LSASS, and it can patch the specific key to LSASS. And then at the end, LSASS gets ready to start doing this authentication. So a process binding to a port, a process connecting to an IP via a specific port. So now we're kind of like telling this story a little bit, just using our data modeling concepts. And then this is very interesting. Sysmon event ID 3 gives you that information that you saw before, a process connecting to an IP, but you do not get user information in this event log. You get it with event ID 3. So if you want to do a use case about users and processes together as a relationship, you need a different event log, okay? And then we see 4648, the moment the user wants to authenticate to the specific resource, then it's gonna be using explicit credentials. And then we see the whole ticket, there it is, authentication in there, all the way to the ticket, the service ticket. And then we have the user authenticating to the box, and this happens on the server side. So as you can see, Pedro is authenticating. It's not C Brown anymore. So we are trying to understand what we get and document it and building the relationship in that specific log, because that's going to help us for our data analytics. And then we see the user accessing a network share and things like that. So now I'm going to show you another variation real quick, which is with C# Rubius project from our coworker Will Schroeder, Harmjoy. And then he pretty much started building this tool that does not touch LSASS, does not let LSASS doing all this Kerberos authentication. It crafts the traffic and then does this whole ticket request and response. It's very interesting in here. So let's just do it again. So we have our tool in there, and we do have our hash and our target. We're going to do these same steps just to show you that it's not being run as an admin. It's just a regular user. And this is actually one of the beautiful things about this, because you can run this without being admin, because you're not touching LSASS, you're not patching LSASS with a new key. So we're doing our basic test, access denied, of course, same concepts. But now if I use Rubius, it's a C# implementation of Delphi's KeyQ project. We can just use the hash of Pedro again, and then we run it. And then from there, what is going to happen is LSASS is going to, Rubius is going to manage all these, like sending the key, getting a ticket. As you can see, it's doing this whole request, and then gets the ticket back, and then imports that ticket into the current logon session. So now, without opening a new process, we can access the domain controller. So in here, we're going to start looking at a couple of different events, similar, but something interesting is that we jumped straight to the authentication events. We didn't do anything with LSASS in between. And in here we see Rubius getting ready to talk to somebody. Rubius talking to the domain controller via port 80. And all these maps to our modeling on the top with a specific sub-data source. Once again, information about a user with sysmon event ID 3. And then the same concepts with the ticket request, service ticket request, authentication to the server side, all the way to accessing a share. The interesting piece about this is that LSAS was managing the authentication first, but then now Rubius is doing it by itself. So if we, and here we provide more information about the user, if we throw this logic to 3 million events, just network events in a regular lab, this is for our class lab that we do for a whole week. Only 29,000 events happen, processes talking to port 8080, which is Kerberos port protocol. And we see that LSAS is the only one doing it. So the moment you just run Rubius, then you pretty much stick out right away from a network perspective and process to an IP and to a user. But the idea here is that I was able to see that with this event log, I can start creating relationships on what users are accessing my servers or via port 88 that are not system and is not LSAS, for example, from a user, from a process perspective. The idea here is to start mapping our methodology to what we saw during this simulation. And we can see that Rubius uses different, less sub-data sources and less specific event IDs. And that's just because of the nature of the tool. So instead of modifying attacks data sources, because I'm not changing the first one authentication logs, I'm at least giving you some details into what it could be. And then we also have some extra data sources that would allow us to also probably contribute to the attack framework, because those two data sources at the bottom allow me to get more context and get to the network piece of of this attack. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto and Luis. I think this is yours.
Yes.
So our next speaker is Carl Sharman from CrowdStrike. Threat hunting is not an abstract idea to Carl, as he began his career as an Air Force intelligence officer and continues to serve in the Air National Guard as the Director of Operations for a cyber intelligence squad. Prior to joining CrowdStrike, he worked as a threat intelligence analyst at the Washington State Fusion Center and the Department of Energy's Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Please welcome Carl Sharman.
Thank you very much, Rich. Sounds like this is on. Good to go. All right. Thanks. Well, it is absolutely a privilege to be here and be a presenter at the first ATT&CKcon. So thank you, MITRE, for this opportunity. I'm going to be talking today about analyzing targeted intrusions through the lens of the attack framework. I work at CrowdStrike as part of our Overwatch team. That's our threat operations team, threat hunting operations team. And we began adopting attack late last year, early this year, to help us better understand, better categorize and track adversary TTPs as we were observing them in the wild. And so what I'm going to talk about today is how we implemented that process and some of our findings so far to this point. A little about me. Rich talked about my background. I'm a family man. That's my family there. I'm a beautiful wife and beautiful young girls. I have to give a shout out and thanks to James for his presentation this morning and giving me that dad joke. One thing, if there's anything I've learned as a dad, you can't have too many dad jokes in your inventory. So greatly appreciate that. Also, I have to thank MITRE for the trinkets in the swag bag, because another thing I've learned being a father, it helps if you can bring back some gifts if you're away on a work trip. Come back and you don't feel as guilty if you can bring back something nice for the kids. But my wife has made that a bit more challenging. She's banned any candy and stuffed animals now. We have too much of that stuff in the house. And so now I've got a great spin on the classic game of bingo to bring, as well as a great big flag that kids can have fun with flags. So yeah, it's been a successful trip, I would say already. Okay, so I'll talk about the overall project, this process of how we are implementing and using attack for our threat hunting operations, give you some results overall from a high-level summarization of what we found so far, pull out some interesting examples of technique technique usage that we've seen in the wild for each of the different tactic families within the attack framework, and then draw some conclusions at the end. Okay, so the project overall, why did we begin using attack? What was our goal for performing that type of research into our intrusions? Well, first of all, we wanted to develop a strong baseline for adversary TTP usage we were seeing in the wild. As has been talked already in this conference, it's very helpful to have a common taxonomy, a common standard language or framework to work from when you are analyzing and categorizing tactics over time. Prior to implementing attack, when we would make assessments on changes in TTP trends over time, those assessments were somewhat subjective because we didn't have that standard common framework to work from. So we're anxious to be able to implement attack because it was going to meet that need for us. And from that point forward, when we have established baseline of TTP usage, we could accurately and confidently measure changes in TTP usage into the future. So that was a benefit. Also, we were hoping that we could develop some more robust adversary profiles. When we observe adversaries performing intrusions against our customer networks, we could plot their tactic and technique usage using attack, build those profiles for each adversary. I know that sort of analysis is already available open source through the MITRE website, and using the attack navigator to visualize that, all that's good stuff. But we wanted to do that same sort of analysis based on our view of the world, what was available in our customer data set and how did that compare to what's open source. So another way we could use this attack framework to better get an understanding of the adversaries we were seeing. So that was the other objective of implementing attack for us. And how did we go about that process? Well, first of all, it was pulling out all of the data surrounding the intrusion we were finding. So when our threat hunters would identify an intrusion, they'd do their initial triage, analyze it, report findings to the customer, and then after the fact, we would go back and analyze all the individual command line executions for all relevant process trees associated with that intrusion. So it can be a bit laborious of a laborious process, but we wanted to analyze all the command execution, everything that was happening during the attack, and compare that to what we know of techniques that are listed in the attack framework, and plot those and chart those over time within the intrusions themselves. So a lot of tracking went into and a lot of human eyes and review to go in and review these intrusions as they were happening. You can see the MISP logo up there. We use the MISP tool as a way of actually tracking the TTP usage for each of our intrusions over time. So that was very handy for that purpose. And for clarification, I should point out that we were as consistent with our mission in the Overwatch team doing our threat hunting. We're looking only at those targeted intrusions, those advanced and or persistent, more sophisticated adversaries trying to fly below the radar on our customer networks, and whether it be traditional state-sponsored motivation or also criminally motivated adversaries as well. But those that are considered targeted intrusions are what we're primarily looking at, not the other threat types that are out there. And there were certainly some challenges in going about this process. First of all, understanding intent. As we were plotting tactics and technique usage among adversaries, we were concerned not just with the techniques, but also the tactics. What objectives were they trying to accomplish while performing these techniques and these procedures? And sometimes that could get a little bit difficult because, as you know, some techniques fall into more than one tactic family. And so when we see an adversary using scripting, well, are they using it for defense evasion purposes to try and hide maybe what's going on within the script? Or are they executing scripts for the purposes of facilitating easier and quicker execution? Sometimes it's hard to judge that intent. So that was certainly a challenge. Another challenge was the potential for human error because, like I said, we're going through and reviewing these command line executions at length. There's a lot of data to go through, and we wanted to be as accurate as possible. So we were looking at that with human eyes. So there's certainly a potential with the volume of data we're looking at that perhaps we missed something or perhaps we mislabeled something. Where that is a possibility, we definitely tried to minimize that as much as possible. As a side note, we are working and exploring different ways that we can automate a lot of this categorization and tracking. We do that a little bit, but as James's presentation pointed out this morning, there are potential pitfalls in some of the automation, so it also helps to have human eyes on things. But perhaps next year we can talk more, explore and consider presentations that talk more about how we can better automate analysis using attack. All right, what were the data results of what we found so far? High-level summary here as we get started. We looked at all of our intrusion cases starting in January, and we're continuing to do it to this day, but for the purposes of cutting this off for packaging our presentation up in a nice format here to deliver to a public audience, we cut our data off at the end of July for what we're going to present. During that course of time, I have analyzed numbers and numbers of intrusions in the wild, and what we saw in the course of all those intrusions were over 1,200 instances of a technique being used at least one or more times in the course of a single intrusion. And when you added that up and plotted that out across the entire matrix, there were over 151 technique types used total during the course of those 7 months. And so if you remember, when you look at the, and again, I'm talking primarily about, exclusively, I'm talking about the attack for enterprise framework here. I'm not talking about pre-attack or attack for mobile, some of the other, I'm talking strictly attack for enterprise, could be Windows, Mac, or Linux. That's the attack matrix I'm referring to here in this analysis. But again, yeah, we saw 151 total technique types used in the wild by true malicious adversaries. And based on the total number of techniques, which is well over 200, we saw over half techniques used during the time period, which was pretty good. From our sense, it emphasizes the rich data that we get to have visibility into. Another quick summary chart there on the left just shows you the different threat types that we observed in this data set. Almost half were considered state-sponsored adversaries that we attributed those intrusions to. A smaller percentage, about 20%, 19% were criminally motivated, targeted adversaries, and then the remainder were unattributed. And as far as intrusion cases go by operating system, that's the other chart there. The vast majority were Windows enterprise networks, where we identified the activity with a small percentage there of Mac and Linux. That's been changing here in more recent months. Like I said, we cut the data off at the end of July, and we're definitely seeing a bit more in Linux and Mac these days than what was happening earlier in the year. And I should also clarify that this is just what we've seen on our customer networks. With our view of the world, we're not trying to project any global assessments or global trending based on these findings. This is strictly what we're seeing on that more limited scope. And some of you out there are members of different verticals. And so based on industry vertical, we wanted to share some of our findings, give you a sense of what that has looked like as far as where we're seeing these intrusions take place. A lot happening in the technology space, our professional services industry as well. Not as much, at least to this point this year, in verticals where we've seen higher percentages in years past. Look at like defense or biotech, pharmaceuticals, not quite as much there happening so far this year. But again, wanted to give you some of this context as we dive into some of the more specifics. Okay, I know this is zoomed far out and hard to read, so you don't feel like you need to read all those individual lines. We're actually going to zoom in and look at each of these individual tactic families by themselves. But to give you an overall view of what this looks like when we plotted out a heat map to look at the entire matrix, the darker color red means that's the more often we've seen it, seen the tactic. And then if it's grayed out, that means we didn't see it. And then you have all the shades of red in between. And the darkest colored red techniques are the ones you certainly expect to see most often. Command line interface, you're going to see that in the vast majority of the intrusions. That's because an adversary is going to want to get shell and perform their command line execution. So that's commonly seen, and that dark of red means we've seen it well over 50 times, 50 different intrusions. That would be the higher end, and that's the minimum for that color of red. So you could go up even further than that. And then the different shades of red are different level of frequencies going down from there. I won't spend too much time talking about the breakdown in colors, but to give you a general sense, that's where the colors are coming from. So let's dive into each of these individual tactic families now. Talk about initial access. So when you look at the heat map for initial access, the most commonly used technique we saw certainly was valid accounts. Again, we're not saying this is what the most common technique is globally among targeted actors. This is strictly what we're seeing. And keep in mind that we are performing threat hunting operations. So we're looking for adversaries already on the network who are flying below the radar. And so in a lot of those cases, or maybe we're coming in a lot of times, we're brought in a post-exploitation scenario. And so that's why we see adversaries who have already been on the network, they've already done their credential harvesting, and when they come back and return, we catch them, we see them, they've already compromised those credentials, and they're using those valid accounts to to return to the network. An example here to call out is a case that occurred against a think tank organization where they used a spear phishing link technique to target that organization. Not the most advanced technique, but the method in which they used social engineering here was interesting. The purported user was a university professor who persona that was reaching out to the victim, and they reached out to this victim because the victim was an expert in global economics, and the university professor claimed to be holding a class on that particular topic, and they wanted this victim's expertise to participate in the classroom discussion. And so the victim, thinking this was a legitimate university professor email account it was coming from, agreed and was honored to be asked to participate as an expert in the class discussion. And so in return, the university professor persona sent a spearfish email with a link to download the teleconferencing application software that was needed to participate in the class discussion. And the user did so and installed the teleconferencing application. However, also along with it, some malicious backdoors. So that's what happened there, and we're sharing that just to again emphasize that the creativity and the lengths that social engineering that adversaries will go to is definitely remarkable in some cases. As further research, good research that our Intel team did found that a similar sort of campaign was also used to target employees at Bitcoin exchanges wanting to use their expertise in digital currencies to take advantage of getting access to those organizations as well. So a reminder to be on the lookout for those more crafty social engineering campaigns that are out there. Execution, again, when you look at the heat map, this is the sort of stuff you would expect to see based on the way the matrix is set up, command line interface, PowerShell, WMI, you're gonna see a lot of that stuff. But also saw smaller instances of other techniques as well. The one I'll call out here is the install util technique. A lot of people are probably familiar with this, but we have certainly seen it. And in this case, we saw it against an organization in the technology and entertainment industry where a Panda adversary, Pandas are reference to Chinese-based adversaries, performed this attack where the adversary already had access to the network using valid credentials. They actually were accessing the network via TeamViewer, which is legit remote administration software. They were accessing the network through TeamViewer, but they wanted to establish redundant access. So they wanted to get another implant installed in case they were going to lose that TeamViewer access. And so what did they do? They employed the install util technique. Install util, legit Microsoft binary that when executed will run .NET executables, and it bypasses whitelisting while doing so. So in this case, when they ran it, they used it to execute a malicious DLL that had been recompiled in .NET. And when they ran that .NET executable, it turned out to be a variant of plugx. And so they ended up sideloading plugx through a legitimate Flash player process and got execution, got their backdoor working through that method in this case. Next, we'll talk about persistence. A lot of different options here of things to choose from, but I chose to call out a case where hidden files and directories were used for the purposes of persistence. In this case, an academic organization was targeted by a criminally motivated adversary. That's the spider nomenclature for that, for our criminal adversaries is the reference that we use there. And in this case, again, the adversary already had access to the network. They had valid credentials, were logging in via RDP onto the network. And in this case, they targeted a particular machine on the network to install a coin miner. And when they installed the coin miner, they then used the attrib command to go to great lengths to hide it. They didn't just use the H switch to hide it. They also used the R switch to make it read-only and used the A switch to make it archivable. And they used the S switch to make it a system file, all these things to hopefully cover their tracks in case somebody was coming through, conducting forensics, looking for something, they'd see all those file attributes and hopefully pass by and not see it. Again, not the most advanced or sophisticated technique, but another trend that I wanted to point out. However, in the roundtable yesterday morning, I think it was Devin already talked about how cryptocurrencies have become much more popular amongst criminally motivated adversaries as opposed to ransomware. So that's been talked about at length. So thanks, Devin, for stealing my thunder. I'll just move on. Privilege escalation. Here, the example I'm going to pull out is bypassing user account control. And this was a case where we were again called in after exploitation had already occurred. And we observed Helix Kitten, an Iranian-based adversary, was present on this network for a travel and professional services organization. And in this case, they had an implant running on the machine, but when we rolled out our CrowdStrike Falcon sensor, killed the implant in an automated fashion, so it was no longer working. The adversary somehow became aware that their backdoor wasn't working, but they, again, had redundant access. You're noticing a theme here. These adversaries are very good about redundancy in their access. And so what they did is, shortly after they realized that the implant was no longer working, they accessed the box using valid credentials over PSExec. And when they did so, they attempted a number of different techniques and methods to try and get their implant working again, trying a number of different measures and troubleshooting to get that implant running. And they couldn't quite figure out what was going on. So one thing they did is they tried to modify the registry through this command line here. And what that essentially does is disable user account control remote restrictions, which is a feature of Windows Vista on up, where if you log in over a network logon to a remote machine, and even if you're using an account to log in that is on the in the local administrators group, if you're coming over a network logon, you're still not going to have admin rights on that. So they wanted to get around that by removing those remote UAC restrictions. And they succeeded in doing so. They bypassed that UAC for the purposes and they did escalate their privileges to admin. And so at that point, they thought they were going to work, they'd finally be able to get that implant working. Well, it still didn't work. They never realized that it was because the Falcon sensor was there, so they eventually just gave up and moved on to another machine, trying other things. All right, defense evasion. Again, another case here where there's a whole lot to choose from. But the example I wanted to pull out, highlight here, is using the file deletion technique. This was against an organization in the academic institution, and an unknown adversary used a number of different defense evasion techniques that were remarkable when you look at them in concert with each other. So file deletion in and of itself, not all that advanced, but what we saw here was in compilation, a number of different techniques that were quite remarkable and notable. First of all, when the adversary was targeting different machines, they were quick to use multiple different types of open source shells. And they'd use one type of open source shell on one machine and not use it very long, and then get rid of that shell and move on and do other things to other machines using other tools. So they had a very heightened sense of operations security. They were definitely trying to evade defenses. So in this case, one of the target machines they went after, they employed a different open source shell. In this case, the Cactus Torch shell, which some of you may have heard of. It's essentially a JavaScript-based shellcode launcher. It uses the .NET to JScript technique to .NET assemblies into memory for injecting shellcode. And so that's what you see happening in the first command line. They executed it as a scheduled task, but essentially they're using it in the context of a C-script process. And that osww.js file there, that .js file is the one associated with the Cactus Torch implant. So they get it running as in the context of that C-script process, but then shortly thereafter, they use file deletion to delete that .js file artifact. So they delete the artifact, but the shell is still running in the context of that C-script process in memory. And so just another case of one of many other things that happened in the course of this intrusion where the adversary just had a very heightened sense of security, wanting to keep as low a profile as possible, make defenders have to work that much harder to find and remove them from the network. And so it was significant from our point of view, the number of ways they were doing that. Okay, credential access. We see credential access, credential dumping in particular, very often in the attempts that adversaries use to gather credentials. But there was one case in particular against a think tank organization this year that stood out among the others, and that's because the adversary demonstrated far greater intent to gather credentials than what we'd seen in other intrusions. And by that I mean they used several different techniques all in the course of the same intrusion to try and gather those credentials. It was obviously an extremely high priority for them. And so they used credentials and files technique, multiple sub techniques of the credential dumping technique, and also Kerber roasting, all in the course of the same intrusion. So some examples there of the command lines we saw that were doing these things. The first command line is a case where they are copying the group policies preferences files from the domain controller. So that would be classified as part of credentials and files for the attack technique. And with that, you can take those group policy preferences files offline for mining and for gathering further account information. In the next example, this is one of several credential dumping techniques that they use. But in this particular case, they actually downloaded the legitimate Windows sysinternals active AD Explorer tool. And with that tool, it allows them to save off a snapshot of the Active Directory database, which could also be viewed offline for gathering additional credential information. And then lastly, the Kerber roasting technique. So what you see there with the last command line is another case where they brought down a legitimate Windows tool, the set SPN tool. And what that allows them to do by executing that command is to enumerate the domain controller for service principal names. And with those service principal names, then you know the services that you could theoretically request a Kerberos ticket for. And that is just one step and part of the overall Kerberosing process, because then when you collect those tickets, you could take them offline for offline cracking. And obviously that's a gross oversimplification of the whole Kerberosing process and technique, but in essence, that's what that element of the overall technique is doing. And subsequent to this, we also then did see them also execute PowerSploit using the invoke Kerberosing module as part of that process as well. Okay, discovery. I am not going to go into a unique example for discovery because there's nothing too unique about the discovery techniques that we see in use. Everybody does it. Obviously, when an adversary gets on to a box, they're going to want to gather account and network information. So nothing too significant to point out. Nothing happens too far out of the usual with discovery. For time's sake, I'm just going to move on to some of the more interesting tactics and techniques. So we'll talk about lateral movement for our next example. And here we saw a case against a financial institution where an unknown adversary was using the Windows admin shares technique to perform lateral movement. And the examples there, you see actual WMI execution. So why are we calling out WMI? Well, if you look into the documentation for what's considered part of Windows admin shares for that particular lateral movement technique, WMI uses SMB RPC authentication for talking to remote machines. So that's part of the Windows admin shares overall technique, which is why we're pointing it out here. The adversary wasn't necessarily actually using just straight normal WMI commands. They're actually using an open source post-exploitation tool that's based on WMI called WMIsploit. And that's what you see being used here to run these WMI commands. So in the first example, connecting to a remote machine to update group policy settings. And that's because perhaps they've made changes to the group policy security settings and they want to refresh those, get those pushed out to that machine so they can then take out their intended follow-on actions. So that's what's happening there in the first case. And in the second example, you see them simply connecting to a remote server of WMI to enable RDP so that then they could theoretically access RDP as another intrusion vector there for that machine. Collection, moving here quickly. This time's getting short, so I'll try to go quick. Here we saw a case against a pharmaceutical organization where the adversary used a script to automate their collection. And an example of one of many similar command lines is provided here, where they are archiving a number of different types of document files within a number of different directories. So that's just one example of the script execution that was occurring. You see there that it's executing WinRS, which doesn't make a lot of sense because WinRS is a Windows Remote Services legitimate Windows administration tool, not used for data archiving. So why is it we're seeing it here? Well, the adversary actually is using WinRAR. They just renamed it as WinRS to try and obfuscate what they were doing. So that's really a WinRAR execution. And you notice it's got the TAC TA flag with a specific date. What that essentially is doing is looking through all these directories, to only gather the files that have been added or modified since that date. So this indicates that this adversary has been there for quite a while, and they're coming back on a monthly or quarterly, somewhat probably routine basis as part of their operation to come back and harvest the new information that has been added to this particular victim machine. Okay, exfiltration. This was a Linux intrusion against a global telecommunications victim, where the adversary was simply as part of their operation to exfil data using data compression and exfilling over an alternative protocol. That alternative protocol is simply email, as it's considered under the attack framework. In this case, they're using UU encode to encode the archived and compressed files over email to that FTP server. So that's essentially what's happening there. Moving along here. Okay, last example. Quickly, this is in a Mac intrusion, remote file copy and web service. Essentially, the attacker was using existing backdoor, but for defensive purposes, they wanted to get a new version of it in case it was being discovered. So they just reached out over curl to bring down a new version of the backdoor they were using, and just highlighting this one because it's using a common web service. We've talked about that over the course of this last few days, as well as open source services like Pastebin, GitHub, Microsoft OneDrive. You know, we see these cloud web services being used increasingly for command and control purposes. So that was certainly the case here. And now getting down to our conclusions. So overall, we were successful in establishing this baseline of adversary tactics and techniques usage so that we can more confidently make assessments for how that's changing into the future. And we are excited about that and looking forward to continuing this process of tagging all of the malicious activity with the attack framework techniques that we're seeing. However, our second goal of developing robust and confident adversary profiles was not something we were satisfied with in the end. And we found that because there are adversaries that regularly use the same techniques, a lot of technique overlap occurring here. And there's times where we see the same adversary at different intrusions using different combinations of techniques as well. So there just wasn't enough. Maybe we need to just gather more data and do this over a longer period of time. But at this point, we're not confident enough in our adversary profiles to say that just looking at the tactics and techniques are enough to really help with attribution. You're going to have to go lower. We did find if you get down to that procedural level, those specific implementations of how techniques are being used, then you can really get into some distinguishing characteristics among these commands that are being executed by adversaries. One quick example, if an adversary is creating a new account for persistence purposes, and that new account uses a specific password, well, that password, if they reuse it in different intrusions, which we've seen before, totally separate organizations, so they create a new account using the same password, that's a pretty unique characteristic that we can then correlate between. So that's the level that we want to get, that we're using at this point to help with attribution. So we think there is some potential there. And obviously, state of the art when it comes to attribution is primarily custom tool usage or looking for C2 network infrastructure analysis. We know there's limitations to that, but we think with if you use tactic techniques and procedures to help with attribution to develop these adversary profiles, then you're really onto something. So we're looking forward to exploring that analysis further. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you.
And if I use all my time, I apologize. I'm available for questions during the break. For sure.
Yeah, since we want to stay in your seats for 1 second, just want to thank Carl for a great talk, and I will just one editorial comment is that one of the things that we're really interested in MITRE is to figure out how to take that data if CrowdStrike and the other folks in this room who have this kind of data are interested in anonymizing it and aggregating and contributing it, how we can try to provide that global heat map for what people are actually seeing in the wild. I think that could be a significant resource. So you'll be hearing from us.
Great. Looking forward to it.
So as we break for lunch, the one last poll question for the large matrix out there is, what techniques keep you up at night? Put a push pin in those. Also, if you're interested, a lot of people have been signing the matrix. Please go ahead and do that. That's awesome. That'll mean a lot to the team here. Today's lunch setup is similar to yesterday's, but there's food. Sort of, don't just stop at the first table. You can check out your other options. But please be back here, and we'll be ready to go at 1:30. Thanks all.
That was great talk. Thank you very much. Had a lot of fun putting it together.
Yeah, I mean, when we saw it,